Hey friends, long before our history books were written, ancient civilizations left behind strange discoveries that defy logic, science, and everything we think we know. Tonight, we're diving into the most mysterious finds experts still can't explain, and some of them will change the way you see the ancient world forever. Let's begin. Dust that dreamed of flight. The desert always begins quietly, as though the land itself exhales before allowing anyone to cross it. In the pale hush of early evening, when the heat retreats and the shadows lengthen like slow-moving tides, the dunes seem to whisper soft currents brushing over their spines. And it is here, in this stillness, that the first of our mysteries waits. Not in the form of a towering ruin or a grand monument, but something far more fragile, almost shy, a scatter of ancient particles, glimmering faintly beneath a thin veil of wind-blown sand. Archaeologists first found the strange deposit near the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, not far from a caravan route traced in records as early as the Han dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE. A place where merchants once travelled in long, wavering lines, their lanterns flickering like amber fireflies against the night. Yet what they uncovered was older, immeasurably older than any trade road. It appeared simply as dust. But dust, arranged in a way no natural force could convincingly explain. The grains were lighter than expected, shaped into hollow forms like miniature reeds or chitinous feathers. When held up to the sunlight, they allowed a faint, uncanny translucence to glow through them. One researcher described them, almost apologetically, as the remains of something that could have caught the wind. And though the phrasing drew uneasy smiles in academic circles, the samples themselves demanded attention. A mainstream explanation soon emerged. Perhaps these structures were remnants of a high silica plant species now lost to the shifting dunes. Ancient botanical remains sometimes harden into peculiar shapes, after all. But that gentle hypothesis, like many offered in haste, began to fray upon closer inspection. For embedded in the grains were microscopic striations perfectly parallel, impossibly fine, suggesting intentional shaping. Not the random etching of weather or water, but pattern, purpose. Some compared them to proto-feathers, others to engineered aerodynamics, far beyond the time frame suggested by nearby geological layers. A few, drifting toward the fringe of interpretation, dared to propose that the particles were once part of a larger structure, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps functional, crafted to ride the desert wind, a device or artifact meant to lift, to glide, or even simply to imitate the idea of flight, long before humans ever inscribed wings upon myths. Scholars still debate whether these markings indicate craftsmanship or merely the seductive tendency of the mind to find meaning in the granular. But beneath their caution lies a quiet undercurrent of curiosity, the same murmur that threads through so many ancient enigmas. For the grains were found clustered in a gentle arc, as though they had once been fixed to the edge of a curve. The shape was too faint to reconstruct completely, yet distinct enough to whisper suggestion something crescent, something delicate, something meant to catch the breath of the moving air. When night settled over the dig site, researchers often described a strange sensation. The feeling that the dunes around them had shifted slightly, not physically, but atmospherically, as though the land remembered something it wished to tell, but could not fully form. A sensation of waiting. It wasn't the unease of danger, but rather the soft pressure of unsolved memory, like standing in a room where someone has just spoken and fallen silent again. As we noted earlier in our outline, many ancient discoveries carry this same breathless pause objects that seem simple until the light catches them just right, revealing a depth of intention or mystery too complex to dismiss outright. And this dust, humble as it appears, belongs firmly within that lineage. If the dunes truly preserved the remnants of an early attempt at flight, whether mechanical, symbolic, or ritualistic, it raises profound questions about who passed through this desert long before caravans inked their way across the horizon. One fringe researcher, a patient man known for collecting improbable theories like others collect stamps, once suggested that the grains might have belonged to a funerary construct, perhaps an offering to guide the spirit skyward. He imagined a delicate structure fragile enough to ride on the edge of a passing breeze released by mourners who stood on these very sands thousands of years ago. His idea was never widely published, but it lingers, fragile and haunting, like the grains themselves. Others point to an oral tradition recorded by Tang dynasty travelers, speaking of the whispering dust said to rise during certain winds and form shapes like the wings of pale birds. While likely poetic metaphor, it is difficult not to wonder whether memory, cultural or otherwise, sometimes persists in the subtlest ways, long after the physical truths have eroded. The stratigraphic analysis places the grains at approximately 9,000 to 11,000 years old, brushing against the end of the last glacial retreat, a time when the world was reshaping itself in slow, sweeping gestures. Perhaps small bands of humans lived along the edges of the desert's earlier form, crafting tools and symbols to make sense of their shifting world. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they dreamed beyond mere survival, dreamed of lift and drift and the strange, trembling promise of the air above them. If these grains truly belonged to an artifact meant to glide, then the desert kept its secret intact far longer than the lifespan of any civilization known to have walked its borders. Even now, stored carefully in temperature-controlled cases, they look as though they could crumble with a sigh. Yet under magnification, the striations remain precise, unwavering, confident, almost like the microscopic fingerprints of intention. At dusk, when the sun dips low and the dunes blush with fading light, the sight takes on an otherworldly stillness. The desert wind moves softly, brushing over the sand like a gentle hand smoothing tangled hair. It is easy, in those moments, to imagine a time when something fragile danced here, something built with patient knowledge, or yearning, or reverence, caught up in the invisible currents of a world still discovering what it meant to lift its eyes skyward. And as the final colours drain from the horizon, one can almost sense the remnant of movement, a faint, teasing memory, dust that once dreamed of flight, and perhaps, if only for a moment, achieved it. In the quiet that follows, as night unfolds its star-threaded cloak across the desert, a soft question rises, one we cannot yet resolve, but must carry forward into the next mystery. If something once flew here, what else might the sands be hiding just beyond the edge of our knowing? Mirrors facing the abyss. Night sinks differently in the highlands, slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The air cools by degrees, and the world gathers itself inward, drawing shadows into its folds like a shawl spread across ancient shoulders. It is here, among the worn limestone cliffs and narrow corridors of stone, that another puzzle waits in patient silence. A place where echoes travel strangely, and where the darkness seems to lean forward, listening. The cave mouth was first documented in the late 19th century by a Bulgarian shepherd searching for a stray lamb. The records of his account are simple yet oddly vivid. He described a draught of cold air as though the mountain itself were breathing outward, and a faint glint of reflected moonlight from somewhere deep inside. He spoke of it with the cautious awe of someone keenly aware that he had stumbled upon something meant to be left undisturbed. And though he never returned, word of the shimmering cavern spread, drawing curiosity like a magnet pulls filings. When the first formal expedition arrived decades later, they found the entrance narrow and unassuming, half hidden beneath drooping pine branches. Only when they stepped inside did the mystery begin to reveal its first quiet tendrils. For along the inner walls, at intervals too regular to be dismissed as chance, lay thin, polished slabs of stone. Their surfaces gleamed with a dull, metallic sheen, reflecting torchlight in long, distorted streaks. The stones were unlike ordinary limestone or quartz. They resembled mica in their layered smoothness, yet were harder, closer to obsidian, but lacking its volcanic origin. And the positioning was uncanny. Each slab leaned slightly inward, angled as if intentionally aligned to capture whatever faint light entered the cave. One researcher noted how even a single lantern, placed at the right point, sent a trembling ribbon of light flickering across the row of mirrors, as though the cavern itself were communicating in pulses of dim silver. To this day, no one agrees precisely who placed them here or why. A mainstream hypothesis suggests ritual use. The Thracians, who inhabited these regions as early as the 5th century BCE, were known to conduct ceremonies in subterranean chambers. Their myths often spoke of doors to the underworld and the gaze of the earth, both of which could poetically align with reflective stones set deep within a cave. Scholars propose that the slabs may have been used to guide light during sacred rites, directing illumination toward altars or symbolic carvings. Yet this theory, comforting as it is, fractures upon closer inspection. For beneath the surface of each stone, visible only when examined under high-intensity instruments, lie faint internal striations, not unlike those found in layered composites. These markings do not follow natural cleavage lines. Instead, they twist subtly, describing curves too deliberate to chalk up to geological coincidence. Scholars still debate whether these formations indicate early forms of craftsmanship, or whether they simply reflect an unusual mineral process we have yet to fully understand. Then there is the placement. The slabs are arranged not merely along the cave walls, but oriented toward a central void, an abyssal drop measuring nearly 30 meters straight down. The floor of this chasm is still unreachable, choked with boulders, and the restless drip of cold water echoing into unfathomable blackness. Those who study the site remark on its unsettling geometry. The mirrors all face the void, as though waiting for something to emerge or return. During an expedition in the mid-20th century, explorers lowered light sources into the pit, hoping to reveal its lower chambers. The beams faded before reaching the bottom, swallowed by a damp, velvety darkness. However, something else occurred, something quietly unnerving. As the lights descended, the reflective slabs around the cavern began to shimmer, each in subtle sequence, producing an eerie ripple of brightness that travelled the length of the chamber. It was as if the cave were reacting, its mirrors sharing some faint communication. Fringe theorists leapt at this phenomenon, suggesting that the slabs might be part of an ancient signalling mechanism or early optical network. Some likened them to heliographs, mirrored devices used for long-distance communication through flashes of sunlight, but such systems require precision alignment across vast outdoor distances, not the cramped interior of a cave, and certainly not a cave facing an abyss that yielded no sign of human passage. Others proposed something more esoteric. The reflective stones, they argued, could be part of a funerary or cosmological ritual mirrors placed to confront darkness itself. In many ancient traditions, polished surfaces served as thresholds between worlds, tools for divination or communication with the unseen. What if these slabs were meant to observe the void, to watch over a sacred boundary, or perhaps to ensure something within the abyss remained undisturbed? More grounded researchers countered with simpler interpretations: early mining prospects, mineral extraction sites, or natural formations overinterpreted by modern fascination. And yet, despite these attempts to tether the phenomenon to practicality, the polished perfection of the surfaces lingers as a quiet contradiction. These stones were shaped, touched, arranged. Their angles whisper of intention. In recent years, microresidue analysis revealed faint traces of organic material along the edges of several slabs, evidence that they may once have been handled by many human hands over extended periods. The residues resemble oily compounds consistent with repeated touching, as though people placed their palms upon the surfaces or carried the slabs before installation. Yet no tools, carvings, or artifacts accompany them. Only the mirrors remain, watching the abyss with patient silence. As we noted earlier, while speaking of the desert grains, patterns emerge when ancient mysteries echo one another. Delicate craftsmanship, obscure purpose, and that lingering sensation of communication across vast spans of time. Here, in this cavern of stilled reflections, the theme persists. The past does not shout. It murmurs, inviting us closer. There is also a curious oral legend from a nearby village, recorded in the early 1900s. It speaks of the mountain with eyes and describes a place where the earth sees its own darkness. Some elders believed the cave was a boundary site, a place where wandering spirits were prevented from losing their way, guided by reflections that showed them where not to walk. The story feels metaphorical, yet chillingly aligned with the cavern's layout. Still, the deepest strangeness lies not in the mirrors themselves, but in the abyss they face. When explorers stand near its edge, they often describe an uncanny sensation, a pull not of gravity, but of attention, as though the void is not empty, but aware in some quiet, indifferent way. It is a psychological trick, perhaps, born from darkness and echo. Yet many report it independently, and when a lantern's glow brushes the abyss just right, the mirrors seem to tremble, catching the faintest motion of the light and reflecting it back like slow blinking eyes. One evening, during a particularly cold survey season, a geologist described seeing something unusual. She claimed that for a fraction of a second, one of the mirrors reflected more than her lamp should have allowed an afterimage, a pale silhouette standing at the far end of the cavern where no one else was. It faded immediately, leaving her uncertain whether it had been a trick of fatigue or something older, watching from the edge of vision. She never spoke of it publicly, but the note remains in her field journal, archived quietly in a museum drawer. Tonight, if one were to enter the cavern, they would find it unchanged. The mirrors still face their unyielding darkness, guarding secrets older than empires. The air still carries that faint metallic chill, as though preserved across centuries, and the abyss still waits patient, inscrutable, swallowing every sound with velvet finality. Perhaps the mirrors once reflected a ritual flame, or the procession of figures walking into the cave with solemn purpose. Perhaps they were positioned to catch the last light of day, sending it into the darkness as an offering. Or perhaps, in some forgotten age, they were part of a dialogue between humans and the unseen, reflections cast toward an abyss they believed to be alive. Whatever their purpose, their silence endures. And beneath that silence, a question stirs, soft as breath over stone. If these mirrors were meant to watch the abyss, what then was the abyss meant to watch in return? The handprint on eternity. There are cliffs in the world that seem older than memory great, stoic faces of stone weathered by sun, wind, and the long patient breath of passing ages. Some rise like frozen waves along salt flats, others loom over valleys where rivers wander in silver threads. And then there are those that stand entirely alone, surrounded by nothing but silence and the spacious hush of open sky. It was on one of these solitary walls, far from any road or settlement, that the handprint was found delicate, solitary, and impossibly persistent. The site lies in the Bolivian Altiplano, not far from the prehistoric settlement of Chiripa, which archaeologists date to around 1500 BCE. Yet the cliff itself predates even that early culture by untold millennia. Travelers who first noticed the handprint were not scientists but local herders, who passed the cliff regularly while tending alpacas. To them, the mark was simply part of the landscape, something that had always been there, like a star whose presence you only notice once someone points it out. A visiting geologist, however, saw it differently. He described the print in his notebook with a kind of restrained astonishment. A single human hand, pressed into the stone as though the rock had been soft clay at the moment of contact. The fingers were long, almost unnervingly elegant, the palm broad but not large. And what puzzled him most was its precision. The contours were so sharply defined that even the faint haul of a fingerprint could be seen under raking light. It was as if the mark had been made yesterday, not across ages. The first attempts to explain it followed familiar paths. Perhaps it was a painting, a stencil made by early inhabitants, similar to the many hand silhouettes found in Cueva de las Manos in Argentina, dating to around 7000 BCE. But this cliff bore no pigment. The colour of the handprint matched the native rock perfectly. It wasn't painted onto the stone, it was within it. Others proposed erosion. Maybe mineral veins split the stone in a way that coincidentally resembled a hand. But again, this theory faltered under scrutiny. The edges of the print were too smooth, too intentional. No natural fracture could carve such immaculate curves. Eventually, small samples of stone were taken for analysis. The results deepened the mystery. The outer layer of rock around the handprint had undergone microstructural compression, consistent with the pressure of something pressing firmly into it when the stone was still malleable. But the cliff face is made of metamorphic granodiorite, a stone that has not been soft for at least 1 billion years. Scholars still debate whether the compression layer indicates an unknown geological process, or merely reflects localized mineral realignment. But no published explanation has entirely silenced the quiet, lingering question: how could a human hand, if it was human, have pressed itself into a rock that had long cooled into unyielding permanence? Theories, as always, grew in the vacuum, left by uncertainty. Mainstream researchers gently suggested that the print was carved, perhaps by a later culture. But if so, the artisan responsible achieved a level of microscopic detail that rivals modern precision stonework tools. Even the most generous interpretations struggled to align with the chirping wind, the remote landscape, and the lack of any accompanying carvings, tools, or marks. More imaginative thinkers proposed something more symbolic. They spoke of ritual touchstones, marks created by ancient shamans not as art, but as declarations, places where the living sought to speak to the stone itself, pressing their hand against the world in hopes it might remember their presence. A gesture meant to bind the human story to the earth's deeper memory. And then, quietly, there were whispers of an even stranger possibility. Some fringe researchers noticed that the handprint appeared elongated, the fingers slightly more tapered than those of the average human. One suggested, somewhat hesitantly, that the print resembled early depictions of mythic beings found in Tiwanaku iconography. a civilization that would not arise in the region until around 500 CE. He argued that perhaps the handprint was part of an older mythic tradition now lost to time, a story preserved in stone long before cultures had names. Official academia did not entertain the theory, yet the observation lingered, the kind that nestles subtly into the imagination. As we noted in earlier sections, these ancient discoveries often share a pattern, a kind of patient ambiguity that resists both skepticism and belief. The desert grains, the cavern mirrors, and now this hand, a sequence of subtle whispers offered by the past, each refusing to declare its truth outright. Locals have their own tale. An elder once told a visiting anthropologist that the hand belonged to the one who touched the sky. According to his oral tradition, long before the Altiplano lifted into the heavens, a lone wanderer walked across the plains at dusk. He placed his hand against the cliff, not to leave a mark, but to steady himself as he looked toward a rising dawn. And the earth, still soft with youth, remembered him. It is a metaphor. Of course, mountains do not soften for wanderers, and granite does not yield to mortal touch. Yet the tone of the tale carries a peculiar weight, a tenderness that feels older than the words themselves. Another tradition, far stranger, speaks of those who walked when the stone was young, beings who shaped the world not through tools, but through presence. The story is murky, more mythic dream than history, but it lingers near the cliff like a shadow caught between light and past. Regardless of interpretation, the handprint remains a paradox. Under sunlight, it appears almost warm, the edges soft with a faint glow. At dusk, it seems to recede slightly, as though pulling back into the stone. And during certain winter's rare, quiet seasons, when frost builds along the cliff face, ice settles more thickly in the grooves of the print than anywhere else, outlining it in a delicate crystalline sheen. Some call this coincidence. Others suspect the stone simply remembers warmth and seeks to preserve it in cold months. Modern scanners have mapped the handprint to remarkable precision. The fingers show subtle asymmetry consistent with biological anatomy. The thumb curves inward with natural tension. Nothing about it feels stylized. It feels, instead, exactly like what it is. The mark of a living being who pressed their hand against the wall with gentle but deliberate intent. But when and how? One researcher, in a particularly poetic moment late in the evening, wrote in her field log, "It feels less like a mark left for us, and more like a memory of a moment that belonged entirely to the stone." Such thoughts lead inevitably to deeper wondering. What if the cliff was once part of a geothermal field, still warm and pliable? Could early humans, long before Chiripa, long before any known settlement, have wandered here, placing their hands on the rock while it cooled? The idea remains speculative, yet not impossible. Much of Earth's geological story is told in immense erasures, eras wiped away by uplift, erosion, tectonic breath. A single palm pressed into warm stone could easily be lost amid the shifting crust, preserved only by chance. But skeptics point out that even in such rare geothermal conditions, a handprint would distort as the stone solidified. The crisp perfection of this mark defies that natural process, which leads, inevitably, to more unorthodox musings. Perhaps the hand was carved with intent so precise that it mimics natural pressure down to microscopic detail. Perhaps it was part of a ritual long forgotten, or perhaps borne out only in quiet speculation it was meant as a message. A moment frozen as testimony. I was here. The surrounding landscape offers no clues, no carvings, no artifacts, not even scattered tools, only wind stretching across the high plains, carrying with it the unhurried sigh of distant mountains. Sometimes, in late afternoon, when the sun angles low and the shadows grow long, the handprint seems almost alive. Travelers say that it catches the light in a way none of the surrounding stone does, as if the cliff itself leans toward the warmth. Others claim that placing their own palm against the ancient mark brings a faint sense of presence, not supernatural, but intimate, like touching a thought left behind. Whether these feelings arise from imagination or something older, no one can say. Yet the hand remains, enduring the slow passage of centuries. A gesture frozen not in disobedience to time, but in quiet cooperation with it. A small testament embedded in a world that seldom preserves the delicate moments of individual lives. And there, beneath the vast open sky of the Altiplano, the hand seems to pose a question that grows deeper the longer one contemplates it. If a single touch can outlast an age, what else might be waiting? Pressed into the stone of forgotten time, just beyond where our eyes have yet to wander. Rivers, carved in reverse. There are landscapes where time feels reversed, where the earth seems to have sculpted itself in defiance of all the patient logic we trust. In such places, the wind runs along unexpected paths, the stones seem arranged by unseen hands, and the land bears scars that flow against the natural order. One such place lies in the rugged heart of the Arabian Peninsula, where a winding gorge cuts through the high desert like a deep, deliberate incision. It is here, among weathered ridges and ancient silence, that the rivers appear to have flowed backward. The site is part of the Al-Wusta region, where paleo lake beds date to roughly 85,000 years ago, an era when early humans migrated across these lands during humid pulses of the Pleistocene. Yet the gorge itself tells a different story. Its channels run upward, not downward. The carved grooves widen toward the cliffs, not toward the valley. And the smoothness of the rock, the unmistakable signature of persistent, flowing water, traces an impossible path, as though pulled against gravity by a force long forgotten. When early explorers first mapped the formations in the 1,930 seconds, they dismissed the phenomenon as an illusion caused by shifting sand dunes. Later researchers assumed tectonic uplift had tilted the terrain after the river dried, reversing the slope. But core sampling revealed no such uplift. The strata lie level, undisturbed, unchanged for nearly 1 million years. And still the grooves point uphill. Scholars still debate whether this is evidence of an ancient reverse flow phenomenon caused by catastrophic backflooding, or whether something more unusual shaped the gorge. But even the backflooding theory falters. There are no sedimentary deposits consistent with such an event, no collapsed channels, no delta-like silt to explain the reversed patterns. Instead, the channels curve gracefully, almost elegantly, spiraling into narrow crevices polished to a sheen that glimmers in the afternoon sun. Some of the grooves even appear braided, as though multiple streams once twisted together in a dance of improbable ascent. And at the uppermost end of the gorge, there is a shape carved into the cliff like a crescent hollow where the backwards flowing channels converge. It resembles not the mouth of a river, but the bowl of some enormous vessel scooped into the stone. Its smoothness suggests intention, yet no tool marks have ever been found, only the quiet, persistent impression that water once moved where it should not have moved at all. Locals have long regarded the gorge with wary respect. Bedouin stories speak of the water that climbed the sky, a legend recalling a time when the desert was alive with rivers that moved according to the will of hidden spirits. One elder told a visiting anthropologist that the gorge was carved when the world was still deciding which way to flow. A poetic notion, yet one that lingers, soft as wind against the stones. By the mid-20th century, geologists returned to the site armed with more sensitive instruments. A trio of French researchers conducted flow simulation modelling on the grooves and determined, to their disquiet, that the channels were carved by consistent movement, not a single event, but decades or centuries of steady, directional flow. Their findings were quietly archived, overshadowed by more practical studies of nearby lake basins. Yet the gorge remained, whispering its contradiction. As we noted in earlier sections, ancient mysteries often speak through patterns, precision where there should be chaos, subtlety where there should be erosion, and intention where nature alone cannot account for the detail. These reversed waterways join that quiet lineage, offering a puzzle that defies both conventional geology and human expectation. A fringe theory arose in the 1,980 seconds that the gorge might be the remnants of an ancient water-lifting mechanism, an early hydraulic system so immense that its marks scarred the cliffside. The idea was dismissed as fanciful, lacking evidence of habitation or technology. Still, the theorist pointed to the bowl-like depression at the top of the gorge and suggested it was a reservoir, one that once held a weight of water capable of forcing flow in an upward arc. Others drifted even further from academic shores, proposing that the channels were carved not by water but by sound, low-frequency vibrations capable of eroding stone over long periods. They noted how the gorge produces a strange acoustic phenomenon, a low hum, perceptible only at dawn, like distant chanting. Scientists attribute this to wind resonance within the narrow passages, and yet the hum fits uncannily with certain petroglyph depictions, found 200 kilometers away spirals surrounded by wavering lines, possibly representing sound or breath, whether related or merely coincidental, remains unanswered. More grounded hypotheses focus on paleoclimatic anomalies. During pluvial periods, the peninsula saw increased rainfall and shifting hydrological patterns. Perhaps the gorge was once part of an interconnected system whose gradient has since been obscured by erosion. But this too has problems. The erosion patterns inside the gorge remain pristine, unweathered by collapse or lateral shifting. They look, in many places, almost new. One striking detail has baffled researchers for years. The mineral deposits along the upper grooves contain trace elements not found in the surrounding cliffs. Minerals typical of deeper, older strata, exposed nowhere nearby. This suggests the flowing water originated from a source buried far below the surface, yet rose against gravity through an unknown vent before spilling across the gorge. A sort of natural fountain, perhaps, or something more shaped, more controlled than nature typically allows. In 2012, satellite imaging revealed a faint, circular depression atop a plateau several kilometers upstream from the reverse channels. Its geometry is too precise to dismiss. A perfect ring, half eroded, its edges softened by centuries of wind. If this depression was involved in the gorge's formation, then the flow patterns may represent a broader system, one no longer functioning, its purpose lost to time. That circular structure remains unexcavated. The desert, as always, keeps its counsel. Standing within the gorge at sunset, one can feel the air shift as the heat escapes the stones. The walls glow deep gold, then bruised violet, then fade into the soft charcoal of approaching night. And as shadows fill the channels, the illusion becomes stronger, not of water flowing upward now, but of the memory of water. As though the gorge holds the imprint of movement long ceased, a ghost river carved into the bones of the earth. Travelers often describe a strange sensation while walking the paths. The uncanny feeling that the ground is sloping downhill when it visibly slopes upward. A trick of perspective, perhaps, or a remnant of some deeper geomagnetic anomaly. But the feeling persists, unsettling in its subtlety, as if the landscape is quietly insisting on its own truth, one opposite to what the eyes perceive. Whether the gorge is a product of unknown geological forces, an ancient hydraulic feat, or a relic of some forgotten natural anomaly, its existence lingers like a question whispered into the deep desert wind. If the rivers once flowed in reverse, what moment in the Earth's long memory were they trying to retrace? And just beyond the upper bowl, where the last light touches the stone, lies a narrow passage unexplored, shadowed, leading deeper into the plateau, a place where the upward grooves continue, faintly, almost invisibly, as though the river's impossible journey did not end here at all. Thrones without their kings. High plateaus have a way of holding silence, not the empty kind, but the deep, resonant quiet that suggests something once happened there, something the land remembers, even if we do not. The winds move more slowly across such heights, as though reluctant to disturb whatever memories remain settled upon the stone. And it is, on one such lonely rise, tucked within the rugged folds of Armenia's lesser-known highlands, that a circle of stone thrones sits exposed to the open sky. They are arranged in a perfect ring, each carved from a single block of basalt, each positioned to face inward toward a central clearing no larger than a hearth. When the sun rises, its light strikes the thrones in a gentle sequence from east to west, illuminating them one by one, like patient actors stepping into a spotlight. And yet, for all their quiet grandeur, no king, chieftain, or ruler has ever been found associated with them. No burial mound nearby. No inscriptions, no marks of ceremony, only thrones, 15 of them, each slightly different in shape, but unmistakably made for sitting, though for whom, no one can say. The site was first noted in the 1920 seconds by a local shepherd who believed the circle to be the remains of an ancient meeting place. He spoke of it with reverence, claiming that his grandfather called it the Council of Shadows. When archaeologists finally conducted a formal survey decades later, they were struck not only by the craftsmanship, but by the scale. Some thrones are large enough for an adult to sit comfortably, while others are smaller, more compact, as though designed for individuals of varying stature or entirely different physiologies. The mainstream dating places the formation around 3000 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with early Bronze Age developments in the region. Yet the techniques used to carve the basalt appear far older, reminiscent of Neolithic shaping seen in sites across Anatolia and the Caucasus. Scholars still debate whether the thrones were built by a transitional culture bridging those eras, or whether they mark an older layer of human presence lost beneath successive waves of settlement. If their chronological uncertainty were the only mystery, the thrones might be considered an odd but explainable relic. But there is something else about their design, something subtle, almost unsettling. Each throne bears faint grooves along its arms or legs, not decorative, but functional, like channels meant to hold something. The grooves converge toward the seat, collecting in small, shallow basins, carved just beneath where the knees of a seated figure would rest. Whether these channels once carried liquid, pigment, or some symbolic substance remains unknown. Scanning electron microscopy has detected trace residues of ochre and a darker, unidentified organic compound, but the samples are too degraded to identify definitively. What unsettles researchers is the consistency of the grooves. Every throne has them, though in slightly different configurations, as though each seat had a specific purpose within a larger system, a ritual arrangement perhaps, or a communal act repeated in a circle, each participant contributing to a shared center. Yet, if it was ritualistic, the central clearing remains startlingly bare. Only a faint discoloration of soil marks its boundary, a subtle darkening that persists even through winter snows, as though something once rested there for many years. Geomagnetic surveys reveal no buried stones, no artifacts, no pits, just an empty circle of compacted earth, resistant to ploughing and erosion, as though holding the memory of weight long since lifted. A historian once suggested that the thrones represented early proto-parliamentary structures, a council of elders who met in a sacred circle. It is a comforting thought, a peaceful gathering place where decisions were made under open sky. But the lack of habitation nearby, the absence of tools or pot shards, and the isolated placement argue against it. People gather where life sustains them. This plateau sustains nothing but wind. Fringe theorists, as always, offer more dramatic interpretations. Some propose that the thrones were meant for symbolic entities, deities, or mythic figures invoked during nocturnal ceremonies. Others claim that the seats were part of an astronomical arrangement. When certain stars rise, shadows fall across the central clearing in patterns that resemble unfurling wings. A poetic observation, but one difficult to verify without leaping into speculation. Yet to stand among the thrones at dusk is to experience something undeniably peculiar. As the sun sinks behind the distant peaks, the basalt seats grow cold with startling quickness, far faster than the surrounding rocks. Even in summer, the drop in temperature is perceptible. It is as though the thrones exhale the heat stored within them, releasing it into the evening air in a single, synchronized sigh. Researchers have recorded temperature fluctuations of up to 6 degrees Celsius between the thrones and nearby stones of identical composition. No explanation has satisfied the anomaly. The basalt should release heat uniformly. This cooling effect has sparked yet another theory, that the thrones once held containers or bodies whose temperature changes mattered during ritual. Perhaps the grooves were involved in controlling heat flow, directing liquids whose behavior depended on temperature differentials. Or perhaps the cooling itself was part of a symbolic gesture, thrones growing cold as night claimed the plateau, mirroring the transition between worlds in local mythology. One particularly eccentric researcher likened the circle to a stage for absence, a place where the presence of the missing was invoked by preparing seats for them. He drew parallels to traditions across the world, where empty chairs are set out for ancestors during seasonal festivals. The idea was not embraced academically, but the metaphor lingers. Thrones without kings, seats waiting for guests who never arrived. Or perhaps they did arrive, and simply left no trace. As we noted in earlier sections, there is a recurring motif in these ancient mysteries, the sense of intention without explanation, design without declaration. The handprint in the altiplano, the mirrors facing the abyss, the backward flowing rivers all speak of human presence intersecting with forces or ideas we have not fully unraveled. And here, in this circle of silent seats, that motif deepens. The thrones do not announce themselves. They merely wait, carved with precision and purpose, as though expecting an arrival that has not yet come. A curious detail emerged during a survey in the early 2000s. One throne, slightly smaller than the others, bears a shallow handprint carved into its armrest. Unlike the naturalistic imprint on the Bolivian cliff, this one appears deliberately chiseled. Its style aligns with no known local tradition. The fingers are long, the palm narrow. Strangely, the print is positioned at an angle consistent with someone rising from the seat, as if to steady themselves before stepping forward. The print was dismissed by some as a later addition, perhaps carved by shepherds or travellers passing through. Yet its weathering matches the original surfaces of the throne itself. If added, it was added long ago. Another detail: the thrones produce unusual acoustics. When one speaks near them softly, even in a whisper, the sound carries farther than expected. Words uttered near one seat can be heard clearly, several meters away in the central clearing, amplified not by echo, but by some sympathetic resonance in the basalt. The effect grows stronger when multiple seats are approached, as though the circle holds a natural auditory design. Some researchers wondered whether the thrones once amplified chants or recitations spoken by those who sat upon them. The site has attracted nighttime visitors, anthropologists, travelers, meditators who report similar sensations. A feeling of being watched, not with menace, but with quiet curiosity, as though the circle itself is aware of one's presence. These impressions are subjective, of course, but they mirror the sentiments expressed in old local tales. One such tale speaks of a council that gathered not to rule, but to witness. A group of beings, perhaps human, perhaps not, who met at the world's edge to observe changes in the land. Each throne was theirs, and the central space was reserved for something sacred, the moment of transition. The story ends with an eerie line, often omitted in retellings. The council will return when the wind forgets its path. A poetic riddle, but one that resonates gently in the mind. What remains most striking is the solitude of the place. The wind is the only permanent inhabitant. It moves through the thrones with a kind of respectful hush, as though unwilling to disturb their vigil. The sky above them is vast, an ocean of blue in the day, black velvet at night sprinkled with the fire of distant stars. In such a place, it is easy to imagine long-gone figures, seated in quiet communion, the sky, their canopy, the earth, their table. And perhaps, just perhaps, the thrones were never meant for mortals at all. Perhaps they symbolize something lost, a gathering of roles, not rulers, a circle of presence, not power, something communal, patient, and aware, something the land itself participated in. As the night deepens and the stars sharpen overhead, one throne in particular, slightly offset from the circle, casts a long shadow across the clearing. Its silhouette stretches toward a narrow path leading away from the plateau, a path seldom walked and barely visible except in moonlight, a path that seems to insist, softly, follow the whispering codex. There are books that speak loudly, chronicles of kings, epics of war, confident inscriptions hammered into stone, and then there are books that murmur, books that do not demand to be read so much as invite one to lean closer, to listen. The codex, found in the deep ravines of southern Anatolia, belongs firmly to the latter. It does not shout its secrets. It breathes them softly, faintly, like the rustle of pages in a windless room. Its discovery was almost accidental. In the spring of 1958, following unusually heavy rains, a minor landslide exposed a thin cavity in the cliffside near an ancient caravan route once used during the Hittite period, around 1600 BCE. The cavity was small, barely large enough for a grown man to crawl into, but inside lay something wholly incongruous with the surrounding history. A sealed clay vessel, intact despite centuries of shifting earth. When researchers carefully opened the jar, they found a compact stack of thin, laminated sheets, neither papyrus nor leather, but a peculiar composite material that seemed to fuse fibrous plant matter with a mineral binding. Flexible, but strangely cool to the touch. A codex of unknown origin. The pages gave off no scent of decay, only a faint metallic dryness, like air trapped underground for longer than the memory of any civilization. Yet it was the writing, or the suggestion of writing, that captured the breath of every scholar who examined it. The characters were not letters, not quite. They curled like vines and rippled like currents of water. Some were etched deep, others barely grazed the surface, and when tilted under lamplight, the markings shimmered as though the ink itself held reflective particles. An illuminating effect, subtle but mesmerizing. The codex became known, almost immediately, as the Whispering Book. For whenever pages turned, even gently, they produced a faint susurration, too soft to be mere friction, too rhythmic to be dismissed. Some described it as the sound of silk brushing against stone. Others said it resembled distant rainfall. But all agreed, it was as though the book itself whispered. The earliest translation attempts were met with frustration. The symbols bore no resemblance to known scripts, neither Hittite hieroglyphs, nor Luwian, nor any nearby linguistic tradition. A few motifs vaguely echoed Proto-Elamite markings dating to around 3000 BCE, but only in shape, not in structure. Scholars still debate whether the codex represents a lost language, a cryptic notation system, or perhaps something not linguistic at all, more akin to musical notation or ritual symbology. But the true anomaly lay in the page edges. Under microscopic analysis, the fibers along the margins pulsed with faint magnetic responsiveness, as though aligned with Earth's geomagnetic field. Not strong enough to attract metal, but perceptible nonetheless. One physicist suggested that the codex might have been designed to interact with environmental forces, its pages responding minutely to shifts in air pressure or magnetism. A fringe researcher took this idea further, proposing that the codex was meant to be read not by eyes, but by ears, that the whispering sound produced when pages moved contained patterns, rhythms, and structures encoding meaning. Her theory was never fully pursued, but she recorded hours of audio from the turning pages, noting recurring intervals in the whispering tones. They resembled patterns found in early Sumerian harp tunings, though the correlation remains speculative. Still, the idea lingers. Perhaps the book speaks in frequencies rather than words. As we noted earlier, many ancient discoveries carry the sense of communication across immense spans of time. Mirrors that reflect into darkness, rivers that flow against gravity, thrones without kings. And so too does the codex seem to reach outward, offering meaning in a language half forgotten or never meant for tongues at all. Curiously, one page contains a diagram, a series of concentric arcs intersected by diagonal lines. At first, it appeared purely geometric, but when overlaid with the codex's page-turn whisper frequencies, a researcher noticed correlation. Each arc aligned to a frequency band, each diagonal marking transitions. The diagram might represent a map of sound or of something deeper, perhaps a conceptual structure mapped through resonance. Some linguists, hesitant but intrigued, proposed that the script may encode oral tradition, meant to be recited in specific tones or cadences. Similar ideas appear in Vedic traditions, where precise pronunciation ensures ritual integrity. But here, no oral lineage survives. Only the codex remains, whispering its monotone lullaby. Then there is the matter of the clay vessel itself. Petrographic analysis revealed the clay to be non-local, originating not from Anatolia, but from a riverbank near Mesopotamia's southern marshes. This suggests the codex travelled far before reaching its final resting place. But why bury such an object? Why hide it in a sealed jar, alone in a cliffside chamber too small for habitation? A small, nearly invisible inscription on the inside of the vessel may hint at intent. It reads, at least according to one possible transliteration, something like, "To silence is to preserve." The script resembles early Ubaid motifs, though the connection is tenuous. If genuine, it implies that sealing the codex away was not an act of forgetting, but of safeguarding, protecting something fragile from a world not ready or no longer able to understand it. Local folklore tells of a speaking book, known only in fragments, a tale of an object that murmured warnings during storms, its voice said to echo through the valleys. Elders called it the breath holder, a name implying that those who listened forgot to breathe until the whisper ended. Though clearly mythic, the story resonates oddly with the codex's existence, like a faint echo of a memory carried through generations. During a late-night study session in the 1990 seconds, a linguist reported something unusual. She claimed that while turning a particular page, the whispering shifted pitch sharply, almost deliberately, then softened into a steady rhythm that resembled a heartbeat. She recorded the sound. On playback, nothing unusual appeared, but she insisted the experience was real. Her notes from that evening end with a quiet line, "The book listens back." Her colleagues ignored the claim, chalking it up to fatigue. But others who handled the codex mentioned similar sensations. Faint warmth along the spine, the impression of being observed by something silent and patient. Perhaps these feelings were psychological expectation shaping perception, or perhaps they were responses to the book's subtle magnetic properties. Either explanation satisfies logic, though not intuition. A more conservative analysis points to the material composition of the pages. The mineral fibers may create tiny vibrations when flexed, generating the whispering sound naturally. But even if true, it does not explain the deliberate patterning of the markings, nor the codex's peculiar preservation, nor the sense often noted in field reports that the book feels oddly awake. One passage, near the center of the codex, shows repeated symbols arranged around a spiral. Some believe it represents a calendar or cosmological schema. Others think it signifies repetition cycles of knowledge lost and rediscovered. When modern imaging enhanced the faintest layer beneath the visible ink, researchers discovered older markings erased or overwritten centuries before the final script was applied. A palimpsest, a layered conversation. As the codex reveals itself page by page, it becomes clear that it is less a book and more a memory, a vessel carrying echoes of minds long vanished. Its purpose remains opaque, but its effect is strangely calming. Those who study it speak of slipping into a meditative focus, lulled by the soft hiss of turning pages. Some compare it to listening to a distant tide, others to leaning close to a seashell and hearing the hush of an ancient ocean. Tonight, if one were to approach the codex, resting now under controlled conditions in a dimly lit vault, they might notice how the light glints along its edges, how the pages curve slightly, as though breathing, how the whisper rises when touched, subtle but unmistakable. And in that moment, one might feel a question stirring in the quiet air, woven into the soft rustle of the ancient leaves. If this codex still whispers after all these ages, who or what was it meant to whisper to? Just beyond that question lies a deeper one unspoken, hovering faintly like the breath before speech. A nearby fragment, found in the same region, bears markings that seem to match the codex's script. It has never been translated. It sits in storage, waiting perhaps, for the book to speak again. Flames frozen in amber. There are moments in the natural world that feel like held breaths, seconds where motion is suspended, where time hesitates, where something fleeting becomes strangely permanent. Amber has long been the keeper of such moments. Insects mid-flight, petals caught as if still trembling, ripples of resin hardened into golden stillness. But in the dense forests of northern Myanmar, where the canopy hangs heavy and light moves in fractured, honey-coloured beams, a different kind of preservation was found, something more astonishing, something that seemed, in its quiet way, to disobey the rules of time itself. It began in 2016, when a local miner brought a curious piece of amber to a small roadside market near Myitkyina. The region was already known for yielding Cretaceous period specimens, ancient resin older than flowering plants in Europe, often filled with the delicate remains of insects from 99 million years ago. But this piece was different, not because of what it contained, but because of how it contained it. Inside the oval, translucent fossil was a shape that seemed impossibly dynamic, a curl of something that looked like fire, not flame depicted in pigment, nor a pigment-stained fracture, no. This shape had texture, movement. The resin held, in three-dimensional detail, what appeared to be the flickering wave of a burning material. Like a flame caught mid-dance, its tendril arching upward, in a gesture that felt startlingly alive. The first scientist who examined it described the specimen in careful terms, a complex pattern of mineral inclusions resembling flame propagation curves. Yet even he admitted privately that the resemblance was unnervingly exact. Under magnification, the curve bore micro-layered ridges, typical of organic material consumed by heat. But resin should not capture flames. Fires are too chaotic, too brief. Resin flows too slowly. The physics shouldn't allow it. Scholars still debate whether the formation represents an unknown combustion process, or whether it simply mimics the geometry of flame. But even among the skeptics, a quiet fascination persists. Because this was not the only piece. When researchers acquired additional amber specimens from the same mine batch, they found more unusual shapes. Swirling forms, some like upward tongues of fire, others like collapsing embers. In one amber bead, the preserved shape resembled the flaring edge of a burning leaf, complete with microscopic ash patterns embedded within the resin. Yet no leaf remains existed within, only the ghost of its burning. How does one preserve the shape of something that produces no solid? Something that leaves only heat, smoke, and light behind? The resin samples were dated, using uranium series testing, to approximately 98 million years ago, well within the time frame of a lush, humid forest, teeming with early flowering plants and primitive ferns. Fires were certainly possible then. Lightning strikes may have ignited brush, But resin hardening around a flame? For that to occur, resin would have needed to flow quickly enough to envelop the fire before it dissipated. Even rapid resin flows cannot capture a flame's active shape unless the process happens in mere seconds. Which, of course, resin does not do. Some paleobotanists offered a grounded explanation. The shapes might represent gas bubbles and plant fibers twisted into flame-like forms, coincidentally resembling burning motion, a perfectly reasonable interpretation. Yet, as more samples emerged, the coincidence stretched thinner and thinner. Too many pieces showed the same peculiar geometry. Too many displayed scorching patterns on the inner surfaces of the resin patterns that matched the fractal edges of flame fronts. One sample even bore micro-charred particles embedded along the amber's surface, suggesting that resin flowed toward an active burn. But again, resin should melt in fire, not approach it. As we noted in earlier sections, ancient mysteries often sit in this hazy space between possibility and impossibility. Dust, shaped like feathers of wind, mirrors aligned toward a living darkness, handprints pressed into stone that should never have softened, and now, flames caught, somehow, in golden suspension. Perhaps the most curious piece was found later in a private collection. It contained a thin, spiral-shaped formation within the amber, accompanied by minute black specks. Spectroscopic analysis indicated that the black particles were carbonized, burned, but not fully consumed. The spiral shape, meanwhile, contained heat-distorted microbubbles consistent with rapid temperature changes. A researcher described it as a thermal event preserved in crystal, though he admitted he had no framework to explain it. The fringe interpretations followed swiftly. Some argued that the flames represented resin reacting to an unknown energy source, something that produced patterns similar to fire, but was not fire as we understand it. Others suggested that the amber captured the afterimage of heat through a process akin to radiant imprinting. One theorist compared it to lightning striking sand and forming fulgurite, only here the resin captured the energy wave instead of melting. And then, of course, came the more speculative voices. Those who proposed that the forest may have experienced anomalous atmospheric events, or that the flames were part of a ritualistic process practiced by early hominins, despite the absurdity of humans existing in the Cretaceous. Their ideas were dismissed quickly, but the fact that the mystery invited such speculation speaks to the shape's uncanny nature. Still, even the more grounded interpretations carry intrigue. One mainstream theory suggests a rapid forest collapse during the resin flow. Perhaps branches fell, rupturing resin pockets and forcing the sticky material downward in sudden waves. The resin may have enveloped hot embers or flaming fragments before they extinguished. This could explain the presence of partial burn patterns within the amber, though not the larger flame-like curves, which seem to defy the simple physics of collapse. Another possibility: the flames themselves might not be flames. They could be fungal structures, now extinct, that grew in twisting, fire-like forms. Some ancient fungi, like prototaxites, were massive, towering organisms mistaken for tree trunks for more than a century. What if a smaller fungal species once grew in curling, upward streams that mimicked fire? Yet this does not explain the carbonized inclusions. The burn signatures remain. Even more perplexing is the amber's behavior under polarized light. When illuminated at precise angles, the flame-like shapes exhibit birefringence, splitting the light as though composed of layered crystalline structures. Fire does not crystallize, but something interacting with fire might. During one late-night examination, a geochemist noticed that a particular specimen flickered internally when she moved her lamp, not externally internally. The flame-shaped inclusion refracted tiny pulses of light, almost like a visual echo of the flame it resembled. She recorded her observations carefully, concluding that microfractures in the resin caused the effect. Still, her notes contained one stray line of curiosity. It feels like the flame remembers being flame. Of course, this is poetic speculation. Resin remembers nothing, and yet the shapes persist in their uncanny fidelity. Local folklore surrounding the amber mines adds another layer of quiet intrigue. The Kachin people have long told stories of the sun spirits who walked the forest, beings who carried light as living fire. Their footsteps, they said, left trails of flame that hardened into stone when touched by the breath of the earth. These tales, passed verbally across generations, are metaphorical, of course, yet they echo with unexpected resonance when one holds a piece of amber containing what looks like a flame's last flicker. As we follow the trail of these mysteries across continents, a pattern emerges, not of answers, but of questions layered intricately across time. The flame shapes in amber do not reveal their truth easily. They sit quietly in museum drawers and climate-controlled vaults, suspended in their honey gold, like thoughts paused mid-formation. And sometimes, late at night, when the vault lights dim and the specimens rest in their transparent stillness, some researchers swear they see a faint shift within the resin. Not movement, exactly, more like the suggestion of a ripple, like the memory of a flame that once danced, caught forever between rising and extinguishing. Tonight, if one were to hold such a piece up to the faint glow of a lamp, one might feel the soft tug of awe. The quiet realization that time does not always freeze the things we expect, and preserved inside the ancient amber, delicate as breath, lies a question that flickers softly in the mind. If fire can leave an imprint that survives 100 million years, what other moments, what other movements, might the world have captured without our knowing? Beyond that question waits a deeper curiosity, one tied to the mining tunnels themselves. Recently, deeper excavation uncovered a resin formation unlike any found before. A thick, translucent slab containing not one, but dozens of flame-like shapes swirling together as if caught mid-conflagration. And emerging from its amber depths is a shadowed form, faint, indistinct, but unmistakably shaped. Not flame, not ash, something else, something waiting to be studied, something waiting to be understood. Gates hung on empty air. There are places in the world where the horizon feels unusually thin, where the line between earth and sky seems drawn with a trembling hand, as if reality itself hesitated for a moment before deciding where the ground should end and the heavens should begin. One such place lies high in the limestone ridges of eastern Crete, on a plateau so windswept and barren that even hardy shrubs cling to the soil with quiet desperation. Travellers rarely pass through. Shepherds skirt the edges. But on this lonely plateau stand two monoliths, silent, unadorned, impossibly deliberate, shaped into what can only be called a gate that leads nowhere. Two pillars rise from the rock like sentinels, each carved from single massive blocks of pale stone. They flank a narrow gap, no wider than a doorway. Yet beyond them lies only open air, an abrupt drop into a steep ravine carved by forgotten centuries of rain and wind. There is no path leading to the gate, no steps, no evidence that anyone was meant to walk through it. And yet its presence feels neither accidental nor symbolic. It feels functional, in a way that eludes definition. The locals call it Thera tu Anemo, the door of the wind. The earliest written reference comes from a Venetian cartographer in the 1500s, who sketched the pillars in the margin of his coastal maps. He labelled them simply Porta Abbandonata verso l'aria, an abandoned doorway leading into the air. Later travellers repeated the description, though rarely with the certainty of someone who'd seen it firsthand. For reaching the plateau requires navigating a narrow, serpentine trail that weaves through crumbling cliffs. Even today, few make the climb, though those who do, archaeologists, hikers, the occasional poet, speak of the same uncanny impression, a structure built for a purpose that no longer exists. The stones themselves offer little clarity. They bear no carvings beyond faint vertical tool marks chiseling, likely done with bronze or early iron implements. Dating these marks has proven difficult. Some researchers place them around 1200 BCE, near the end of the Minoan civilization's influence on the island. Others argue for a far older origin, insisting that the mineral patina suggests severe weathering, inconsistent with such a recent timeline. Scholars still debate whether weather alone accounts for the stone's condition, or if the pillars were already ancient when the Minoans first settled the region. But what truly baffles researchers is the alignment. The two monoliths stand not perpendicular to the ravine, but angled precisely, so precisely, in fact, that when the sun rises during the winter solstice, a band of golden light passes straight through the gateway and strikes a distant rock face nearly 400 meters away. That illuminated patch glows for only a few minutes, then fades. No known settlement exists near the illuminated spot. No carvings, no shrines, nothing but a barren cliff. Some suggest the gate was a solar marker. Others propose it was a place of ritual passage, symbolic, not literal. But the angle of the pillars does not match typical Minoan astronomical orientations, nor those of later Greek ritual architecture. It is slightly offset, as though calibrated to something no longer present in the landscape, One archaeologist once joked that the gate looked as though it waited for a bridge, an invisible path once spanning the ravine, since lost to erosion or time. But the cliff edges show no signs of structural supports, no insertion points for beams, no weathered scars where ropes or platforms might have hung. The stone beneath the pillars is untouched, save for wind-carved grooves and the occasional lichen patch. It truly is a doorway suspended above nothing. As we noted earlier, many ancient mysteries share this quality of suspended purpose objects, built with haunting precision, yet stripped of the context that would render them ordinary. The river channels that flow uphill, the thrones carved for missing kings, and here, a pair of gates that seem to anticipate something movement, presence, alignment that is no longer part of the world. One of the more curious discoveries came in 1991, when a team conducted ground-penetrating radar scans around the pillars. Beneath the surface, extending outward from each stone block, lay shallow trenches carved into the bedrock, forming what appeared to be a circular pattern around the gate. These trenches were eroded to near invisibility, but still traceable like the outline of a larger structure long since swallowed by the wind. Some believe they mark where wooden beams or lighter stones once formed an enclosure around the gate, but if so, why did only the pillars remain? And why is the gate oriented toward emptiness, not toward the plateau? An older explanation, often repeated by locals, goes deeper into myth. They say the gate marks the place where the wind spirits passed, moving between worlds. According to a Cretan folktale rarely written but often whispered, the plateau was once home to travelers who walked on air, people who could cross ravines as though the space beneath them were solid ground. The pillars, then, were not for humans but for these beings, a frame for their path gates hung on empty air. This tale is poetic, of course, and yet, when one stands between the monoliths during the early hours of morning, the wind does something strange. It does not simply pass. It funnels through the gap, accelerating in a sudden, almost musical rush. The sound it makes is unlike the general whistle of the plateau winds. It is more focused, tonal, resonant, as though the pillars shape it, coax it into a specific pitch. Some visitors describe the sound as a soft, sustained note. Others hear layers a harmonic flutter, like two tones folding over each other. In 2007, a team of acousticians recorded the wind's behavior. Their report concluded that the gate creates a resonance frequency determined by the spacing and angle of the pillars, consistent only in wind patterns above a certain speed. The effect is technically natural, but what remains unexplained is whether the builders intentionally designed the pillars to produce it. The alignment is too precise for chance. Yet what purpose would a singing gate serve? Fringe theorists seized upon the acoustic anomaly. They proposed that the pillars could have acted as an ancient auditory marker, perhaps a beacon of sorts. Some even suggested that the sound may have guided travelers during fog or storms, the gate acting like a tuning fork for the wind. While unlikely, the idea is not entirely without precedent. Ancient cultures often use sound for navigation, ritual, and communication across great distances. More enigmatic still is the faint discoloration found along the inner edges of the pillars. Under ultraviolet light, a subtle sheen appears, traces of a compound rich in iron oxide and organic residue. It is not paint, it is not lichen. Some specialists describe it as contact residue, possibly left by repeated touching over many years. But the location of the residue suggests hands at odd angles, positions uncomfortable for a person standing on solid ground. Unless, of course, the ground beneath the gate was once different. One speculative study proposed that the gate marked a ritual leap, a place where initiates would jump into the ravine to prove devotion or bravery. But such dramatic theories falter under scrutiny. The site shows no signs of repeated falls, no bone fragments, no remnants of staging, and the Cretan mystery cults of the Bronze Age left behind no traditions involving leaps from cliffs. A more poetic interpretation emerged from the writings of a Greek folklorist who visited the site in the 1970 seconds. She described the gate as a punctuation mark placed by an older language carved into stone. In her notebook, she wrote, "The pillars wait not for footsteps, but for alignment, when wind, light, and the turning of the world briefly meet in the frame of the forgotten." What alignment she imagined remains unclear. But it is true that once a year, during the spring equinox, something subtle occurs. The first rays of dawn stretch between the pillars, and cast a perfect rectangle of light onto the plateau floor. For a moment, no longer than a breath, the shadowless beam outlines what appears to be a path, a narrow band of illumination stretching across the barren stone. It vanishes within seconds. No one has successfully photographed it. The event is too brief, too delicate, dependent on rare weather conditions. But those who have seen it describe the same feeling, as though a doorway opens, ever so slightly, not into another world, but into a memory of one. As we follow the trail of ancient mysteries, such patterns, light, geometry, to intention, begin to whisper to one another. Dust, shaped for flight, mirrors angled toward darkness, handprints pressed into immovable stone, a codex that murmurs, flames captured mid-dance, and now, a doorway suspended above nothing, shaping wind into song. Tonight, if one were to stand at the gate, wind rushing between the monoliths in its quiet, resonant voice, they might feel the faint tug of curiosity pulling them forward. Even though the ravine yawns below, even though the air carries no promise of solid ground, the alignment of the stones seems almost to insist. Step through, and beyond that invitation lies a question, soft but persistent, rising with the wind. If this gate once opened onto something real, some path, some alignment, what world has since shifted away, leaving only the frame behind? Far to the north, recent surveys have revealed another pair of pillars, smaller, half-collapsed, oriented in a similar direction, and between them lies a faint shadow of a path, not carved into stone, but worn into memory. Something connected these gates once, something that did not rely on ground, something that moved through air. The eye and the obsidian. There are stones that simply sit mute, cold, unremarkable. And then there are stones that seem to watch. Obsidian has always belonged to the latter category. Its glossy black sheen has haunted human imagination for thousands of years, used in blades sharper than steel, mirrors that reflected more spirit than face, talismans that captured the dark glint of superstition. Yet, among all the obsidian artifacts scattered across ancient landscapes, one stands apart quietly, unnervingly, as though aware of its own presence. It was unearthed in the early 1972 during a routine excavation near Teotihuacan, the great Mesoamerican city that flourished around 100–550 CE. The dig team was searching near the outskirts of the Pyramid of the Sun when a laborer's mattock struck something unusually smooth enough to ring faintly, like tapping glass. At first, the crew thought it a shard of obsidian mirror, but as the surrounding soil was brushed away, an object emerged that chilled the archaeologists into silence. It was a sphere. Perfect, polished, flawless, approximately the size of a grapefruit. But within its depths, beneath its dark surface, something shifted, a pale shimmer, a faint, curved distortion, a shape that resembled, unmistakably, an eye, not carved, not etched, reflected, as though something inside the stone had captured a gaze long ago and never let it go. Under the desert sun, the sphere darkened to a deeper black, swallowing all colour. But in shade or by torchlight, the faintest reflection stirred within, like a pupil contracting. Not literal, of course, not animate, but disturbingly convincing. Even seasoned researchers admitted that holding the sphere felt like being observed by something patient and ancient. Its anomaly was not limited to appearance. When subjected to petrographic analysis, the obsidian revealed an unusual internal structure. Most obsidian forms in chaotic, swirled bands as volcanic glass cools rapidly. But this sphere showed concentric layers, perfect, even, deliberate. Layers that mirrored one another in spirals, as though shaped on a lathe used by hands impossible to imagine in Mesoamerica's first centuries. Scholars still debate whether these patterns indicate artificial shaping or rare volcanic conditions. The debate is gentle, respectful, but persistent. For though ancient artisans crafted remarkable obsidian blades and mirrors, no known technique allows the carving of a flawless sphere without fracture. Even modern tools struggle to polish volcanic glass without shattering it along microfractures. And yet, here it sat smooth as a raindrop, unblemished as midnight. Local legend offered an older story. Elders from nearby communities spoke of the night stone, an object said to hold the memory of the moon. According to pre-Hispanic tales, certain obsidian mirrors were used not just for ritual, but for gazing into the other sky, a world parallel to ours. accessible through reflective surfaces. The sphere, they said, belonged to the one who walked without shadow, a figure who appears in several Nahua myths as a messenger between realms. Such stories are poetic rather than historical, yet they resonate faintly with another discovery, a circular indentation in the temple district of Teotihuacan, whose diameter matches the sphere exactly. Whether the stone ever sat there is uncertain, but the possibility lingers. The sphere was found wrapped in a textile fragment, preserved enough for approximate dating. Radiocarbon testing placed the cloth around 450 CE, but the sphere itself being stone cannot be directly dated. It may have been ancient long before Teotihuacan's people found it. When researchers brought the obsidian sphere indoors, something odd happened. Under electric light, its internal eye disappeared entirely. The stone went blank, inert, but under flickering flame, a candle, a torch, even a lighter, the reflection re-emerged, not the same each time. Sometimes the pale shimmer curved upward, sometimes downward, sometimes centered, never identical. One archaeologist noted, "It behaves like a mirror with no subject." Another whispered, half joking, "Or a mirror with a subject we can't see." The flame flicker effect deepened the mystery. Modern optical physicists proposed that microscopic curvature variations in the sphere's surface could create dynamic distortions. A plausible idea, but the distortions behaved too consistently, always taking the rough shape of a narrow ellipse, tapered at one end, widening at the other, like an iris, like a gaze. As we've seen in earlier sections, ancient mysteries often behave like thresholds, objects whose meaning shifts depending on light, angle, or context. Dust that floats like wings, mirrors pointed at voids, handprints pressed into impossible stone, and here, in obsidian's black heart, a reflection that should not be there. A fringe researcher suggested that the sphere was used in early astronomical rituals, meant to reflect celestial bodies. Perhaps the eye was a trick of captured starlight, but stars do not imprint themselves permanently, nor do they create elliptical distortions. During a late-night study session, an anthropologist placed the sphere on a shallow clay dish. As she moved around it, she noticed that the reflection inside seemed to follow her not directly, but subtly, as though shifting in her general direction. She tested it repeatedly, placing screens between herself and the stone, altering light sources, adjusting angles. Still, the pale shape drifted, maintaining its orientation. She wrote in her notes, "It acts as though it knows where I am." She crossed the line out immediately, embarrassed. Yet others would later record similar sensations. Despite careful handling, the obsidian sphere displayed another strange property. Its temperature remained slightly cooler than surrounding objects, even after hours under warm lighting. Not cold, but subtly chilled, like a stone touched by morning before the sun rises. Experiments ruled out moisture, internal voids, and airflow. The sphere simply held coldness, as though its core resisted warmth. One geologist likened the stone to a memory, a preserved moment of the volcano's cooling process, suspended forever. Yet this poetic explanation fails to account for the sphere's anomaly. Obsidian normally warms quickly, its dark surface absorbing heat. This one did not. More intricate still were the sound experiments. When struck lightly with a tuning fork, the sphere emitted a pure, resonant tone, higher in pitch than expected. More curiously, its tone shifted slightly depending on direction. When struck from the east, the pitch wavered differently than when struck from the west. The variations were subtle, but measurable. Some argued these tonal anomalies implied asymmetry. Others insisted they pointed to internal structuring, perhaps a hollow core. But imaging scans revealed no cavity, just layered, glassy perfection. Folklore stepped gently into the conversation again. Local storytellers spoke of the stones that listen, objects used by ancient priests to detect vibrations, earthquakes, approaching storms, footsteps of approaching enemies. Perhaps the obsidian sphere was an early seismic tool, but nothing like it appears in Mesoamerican records. There is also the matter of the faint markings discovered upon the sphere after a decade of study. Barely visible, appearing only under certain light, they resemble narrow lines curving around the sphere's surface lines, too regular to be natural fractures. Their pattern suggests a loose spiral wrapping from pole to equator. Some researchers believe this spiral might represent a conceptual map, cosmological or ritualistic. Others believe it is simply a byproduct of polishing, yet the spiral, when traced carefully, leads to a tiny indentation no wider than a pinhead, a depression so subtle it was overlooked for years. Under magnification, the indentation reveals micro-scratches consistent with repeated contact with a fine-pointed tool. A ritual stylus, perhaps, or something else entirely. As we noted earlier, ancient objects often seem to accumulate layers of intention, use upon use, ritual upon ritual, each generation adding meaning to a form that may have begun with a different purpose entirely. The sphere feels like one of these. A palimpsest in stone, an artifact shaped by unknown hands, and then reinterpreted by Teotihuacanos, who perhaps sensed its strangeness. One quiet theory proposes that the sphere was never meant to be an object at all, but a component, part of a larger structure now lost. A mechanism requiring alignment, reflection, resonance. Perhaps the eye was not merely an illusion, but an effect intended to interact with another surface. A mirror staring into a mirror, a gaze completing a circuit. This idea remains speculative. No corresponding artifact has been found, and yet, when the sphere is placed near a flat obsidian mirror from Teotihuacan, one of the common artifacts found in elite residences, something remarkable occurs. The mirror reflects not just the sphere, but an additional distortion, a faint halo of pale light around the sphere's image. A halo that does not appear when either item is viewed alone. Light interacting with light. Memory interacting with memory. If the people of Teotihuacan once used these objects together for ritual, divination, or symbolic communication, then we are seeing only the shadow of a larger practice, the echo of a forgotten technology or belief system. Tonight, if one were to stand before the obsidian sphere held now in a dim vault, resting on soft linen, they might feel the faint impression of being observed, as though the pale ellipse within the stone stirs slightly at their presence, not in recognition, but in quiet curiosity. And in that stillness, a question glides softly through the mind, reflecting itself again and again in the stone's dark depths. If the eye within this obsidian is not ours, then whose memory does it hold? Far away, in the highlands of Guatemala, recent excavations uncovered another obsidian object, a shard, curved, polished, bearing the faint suggestion of a matching spiral. The two pieces hum at slightly different frequencies. Pieces of a gaze, perhaps, pieces waiting to be reunited. Pathways of polished wind. There are passages in the world that feel less carved than revealed corridors that appear shaped not by human hands, nor by time's slow weathering, but by something gentler and stranger. Something like breath. The high mountain ridges of the Karakoram hold many such surprises. Hidden valleys carved by ancient glaciers. Hollow chambers where the air rings like struck crystal. Cliffs smooth as bone. But deep within one of its lesser mapped branches lies a place unlike any other. A narrow system of corridors that gleam as though polished by the wind itself. The discovery came in the summer of 1984, when a survey team from Gilgit-Baltistan trekked through a rarely visited gorge known to locals as Dor-i-Safa, the Valley of Silence. The name was fitting. Even the wind, so constant in these elevations, seemed muted there, as though the air held its breath. One of the mountaineers noticed a curious opening in the cliff face, an oval mouth of stone, smooth-edged, almost inviting. Expecting only a shallow alcove, they stepped inside. What they found was a passageway so smooth, so precise, that it seemed unnatural. The walls curved like the inside of a shell, perfectly continuous, without tool marks or cracks. Their surfaces gleamed with a faint pearlescent sheen, reflecting lantern light in soft, wandering patterns. It looked less like rock than like stone transformed into glass by some slow, deliberate pressure. One climber, running his hand along the wall, murmured, "It feels like touching the inside of a river." The others agreed. The stone was cool, not cold. Its surface had an odd tactile softness, smooth but not slippery, like polished soapstone hardened beyond its nature. As the team advanced, the passage split into 2 more tunnels, then 3, each twisting gently before converging again, forming a subtle maze. Yet none of the paths felt confusing. There was no sense of entrapment or disorientation. Instead, the air carried an almost guiding quality, soft currents that nudged one toward the next opening, like a whisper of direction. Scholars still debate whether these currents are mere natural drafts or something more structured flow patterns shaped by the unique geometry of the stone chambers. But what is undeniable is that the air moves there, not chaotically, not blindly, with intention. When the passages were mapped years later, a strange pattern emerged. The tunnels aligned along curves that mirrored the flow lines of atmospheric pressure systems observed at high elevation. It was as if the corridors echoed the movement of wind itself, pathways sculpted to mimic the invisible dances above the mountains. The mainstream geological explanation is elegant. Over tens of thousands of years, extreme gusts of alpine wind, carrying microscopic ice crystals, may have abraded the soft limestone into smooth hollows. But even proponents of this theory acknowledge its limitations, for wind alone cannot carve stone into surfaces this uniformly polished, nor can it create perfectly consistent radii of curvature across multiple branching tunnels. Nor can it inscribe the faint linear striations, parallel, delicate, deliberate, that mark the walls at intervals, each line no thicker than a hair. A more conservative interpretation suggests glacial meltwater. Perhaps subterranean rivers once flowed here, smoothing the passages before draining away. Yet meltwater leaves behind telltale marks pitting, mineral streaking, layered sediments. None are present. The walls remain unblemished, untouched by the usual fingerprints of erosion. And then there is the sound. When one walks through the pathways, each step produces a soft, melodic resonance. Not an echo, a tone. The walls seem to vibrate gently, shaping the footfalls into a low hum that grows slightly louder at certain bends. Some sections resonate at a higher pitch, others at a low, almost subaudible thrum. It is as though each chamber sings its own note, contributing to a system-wide harmony. In 2006, a group of acoustic engineers analyzed these tones. Their findings, though cautious, were extraordinary. The passageways form a natural resonant instrument, amplifying frequencies between 40 and 70 Hz with nearly perfect clarity. But natural caves seldom produce sustained tones across multiple chambers. The engineers suggested that the geometry appeared deliberately tuned, though they immediately admitted that such tuning would require an understanding of acoustics far beyond that of any known culture in the region's early history. As we noted in earlier sections, ancient mysteries often hum, not metaphorically, but literally. The whispering codex, the singing gate, patterns carried across time, like forgotten instructions spoken back into the world. And here too, in these polished corridors, the land sings not loudly, but with the quiet insistence of something that remembers its original purpose. One chamber in particular, the largest, shaped like the inside of a great horn, produces a tone so steady that researchers nicknamed it the breathing room. When the wind outside rises, even faintly, the pitch inside shifts with it, creating a sense of inhalation and exhalation. Some describe it as soothing, others unnerving. When multiple people stand inside the chamber, the pitch changes subtly again, as though the room is responding to presence. And it is this responsiveness that has prompted deeper, stranger speculation. A fringe researcher, fascinated by the resonance patterns, proposed that the tunnels formed part of an ancient communication system, not for voices, but for wind. He suggested that the corridors could amplify distant storms, allowing early inhabitants to hear approaching weather through changes in tone. The idea seems outlandish, but meteorologists studying the region note that the highest chamber does indeed resonate noticeably hours before sudden windstorms roll through the valley. Another theory, simpler but no less intriguing, is that the pathways acted as a kind of meditative labyrinth, a place where pilgrims walked in quiet reflection, guided by sound and air toward an inner chamber. Indeed, deep within the network lies one final room, small, perfectly round, dome-shaped. At its center sits a single stone platform, waist-high, shaped like an altar but bearing no carvings. Its surface is so smooth that it almost gleams. When lantern light touches the dome's ceiling, the reflection forms an unbroken circle of pale light, hovering like a halo. Some visitors describe an immediate sense of stillness upon entering, as though the air itself thickens, slowing thought and breath. Others report feeling watched not by eyes, but by the space itself. Modern climbers sometimes call this chamber the heart of the mountain. Older locals give it another name, Nafas-e-Kamosh, the breath of silence. Scholars have not determined the chamber's age, though mineral sampling suggests parts of the system may have formed or been shaped during the late Pleistocene. If human modification occurred, it happened long before organized settlements existed in the region. But the idea that nomadic groups carved or polished these passages strains credulity. They had tools, yes, but not the means to smooth stone into such flawless curves, not the ability to tune chambers to specific tones, unless, of course, the smoothing was not done by tools at all. Some geologists propose that intense, focused wind jets formed during rare, high-altitude atmospheric collapses might have polished the limestone in short, dramatic intervals. They point to evidence of similar effects in desert sandstone formations, but even this theory fails to explain the internal tuning. Wind-carved hollows do not create resonant corridors. A more delicate hypothesis emerged in 2018, when researchers noticed peculiar microabrasion patterns on the walls. These patterns resemble the effects of repeated, rhythmic pressure, not enough to crack stone, but enough to gradually polish it over generations. One researcher likened it to the smoothness of stair rails, worn down by millions of hands. But in this case, the hands were wind currents flowing, retreating, flowing again across millennia, as though the wind itself carved these halls patiently, lovingly, shaping its own pathways through the mountain. This notion inspired the poetic term polished wind, a phrase now quietly used among the site's researchers. Tonight, if one were to walk the pathways alone, lantern in hand, the air would lift and settle around them like a living presence. At every bend, the gentle hum would shift, guiding, responding, acknowledging, and eventually they would reach the inner chamber, where the silence grows so deep it feels like velvet against the ears. There, standing before the smooth stone platform, one might feel a subtle sway in the air, a movement not caused by breeze, but by resonance, as though the room inhales with you, as though the mountain listens. And in that hushed moment, a quiet question rises, gentle as breath forming on cold air. If these pathways were shaped by wind over ages, what intention, what memory, guided the wind itself? Far beyond the chamber, new surveys have uncovered yet another entrance half collapsed, but bearing the same pearlescent sheen. The tunnels may extend farther than anyone suspected, perhaps miles, perhaps across mountains, perhaps connecting places once shaped by the same silent hand. Vessels sunk in skyrock. There are altitudes where the air thins enough to feel ancient, where every breath seems borrowed, and every sound arrives softened by distance. In such places, the world seems quieter, older, as though the sky itself presses gently against the earth. One of these places lies high in the Andean Cordillera of Peru, where a windswept plateau unfolds like a sea of stone. Nothing grows there except pale moss and a few stubborn shrubs, and yet, perched along a cliffside, overlooking this stark expanse, lie shapes that resemble vessels, boats, or their echoes carved into the very bones of the mountains. The locals call them barcos de la roca del cielo, vessels sunk in skyrock. The name was once used figuratively. A poetic flourish passed from shepherd to shepherd. But when archaeologists ascended the plateau in the 1,960 seconds, they found the phrase unsettlingly literal. Embedded in the limestone shelves were hollowed forms, unmistakably shaped like hulls. Not symbolic, not vague. Boats long, curved, with keels and rib-like ridges, yet formed from immovable mountain stone at an elevation far too high, far too rugged, for water to have existed here in any form capable of holding vessels. 6 such hollows appear along a single cliff band, 3 large, 3 smaller. The smallest is barely the length of a child. The largest spans nearly 9 meters longer than some early Incan fishing canoes. Each hollow is carved so smoothly that the stone feels polished, as though shaped by patient hands into a symmetry that defies erosion. The first assumption, naturally, was that these vessels were ritual forms. Many Andean cultures crafted symbolic boats to represent journeys between worlds, echoing myths of cosmic rivers and celestial lakes. Perhaps these forms were carved as offerings, perhaps they were funerary, but as researchers descended lower into the carved cavities, they found striations thin, parallel, shallow grooves, indicating not scraping or chiseling, but pressure, the kind of pressure that occurs when wood rests repeatedly against stone. Scholars still debate whether these striations truly signify contact with real wooden objects. The idea seems implausible. Who would drag full-size boats to 4,200 meters elevation? And why? No lakes, no rivers, only wind, rock, and the long, quiet fall of snow. A second hypothesis proposed that the boats were not hollows at all, but remnants of eroded rock shelters whose curved ceilings had collapsed. But this theory dissolved quickly. The forms are concave, not convex. They cradle like troughs, not arch like roofs. Their edges rise with intentional symmetry. Nature does not carve such purpose into stone casually. A third hypothesis, more cautious, suggested that the forms might have been used to ferment or store something grain, ceremonial liquids, pigments. Indeed, residue testing did reveal faint traces of organic compounds in 2 of the hollows. But these residues were ambiguous, degraded beyond decisive identification, and they did not explain the maritime resemblance, the unmistakable curvature of prow and stern, the rib-like shallow depressions at intervals that mirror the spacing of boat planks. As we've seen in earlier sections, many ancient enigmas carry the signature of deliberate craftsmanship paired with an absence of context. The thrones awaiting absent kings, the doorways leading into sky, the obsidian eye that remembers light. So too do these mountain vessels whisper of a purpose unseen. What puzzled researchers most, however, was their orientation. Each carved hull faces slightly southeast, exactly 31 degrees from true east. When surveyed precisely, the angle aligns not with the sunrise, but with the rising of the Southern Cross as it ascended in the sky, around 2000 BCE. At that time, the constellation lifted above the horizon at the precise angle the vessels face, as though the hollows were aligned to greet not water, but starlight. This alignment sent ripples through the archaeological community. Andean cultures did place profound importance on skywatching, particularly with constellations interpreted not by stars, but by the dark nebulae between them. But vessels carved at such altitude, angled toward stars, raised questions difficult to reconcile with known traditions. A fringe group of researchers proposed that the vessels represented celestial boats, intended to guide the spirits of the departed toward the star rivers above. A poetic idea, though little supporting evidence exists. Others argued that the hollows were mold forms, patterns for shaping wooden vessels elsewhere. But who would ascend a mountain to carve molds for boats meant for lowland rivers? And yet, the striations within the hollows continued to complicate every theory. Under macrophotography, the grooves resembled abrasions caused by wooden surfaces rubbed or dragged repeatedly along the stone. Even more perplexing, mineral discoloration at the groove's edges suggested prolonged contact with waterlogged material, waterlogged wood, in a place where liquid water rarely survives the night. One anthropologist noted the peculiar pattern and wrote, "It is as though something heavy rested here, rocking gently, but no wind or water exists to cause such motion." She later added a quieter line, "Unless the vessels were carved after something heavier had already rested here." This comment inspired a new speculative thread. What if the stone hollows were not original carvings, but negative impressions? What if something had been placed there first, something shaped like a boat, and the stone was later carved around its resting form, preserving the outline as a rite of memory? It is a delicate theory, yet no more implausible than boats resting on mountaintops. Local oral traditions offer hints, whispers of wandering vessels that travelled on sky roads, stories rarely told except quietly at night. According to one tale, the ancestors once saw boats that flew with the strength of the sun, their shadows passing across the valleys before settling on cliffs to rest. This is myth, of course, metaphor. Yet the specificity of resting on cliffs lingers strangely in the mind. One elder described these vessels not as boats, but as cradles of wind, shelters shaped to carry travellers above the mountains when the valleys were still filled with fog and beasts. He spoke this while sitting near the plateau's edge, gazing into the distance as if remembering something half forgotten. The world was different then, he said softly. The sky was thicker, and those who walked with the wind left marks where they landed. These tales are poetic, easily dismissed as the wandering inventions of memory. And yet, as we noted in earlier sections, sometimes folklore preserves truths thinner than paper, surviving in metaphor long after details slip away. In 2013, a geophysical study attempted to determine the age of the carvings by analysing micro-erosion around their edges. The results suggested a minimum age of 3,500 years, but possibly much older, perhaps as old as 6,000 years, brushing against the earliest pre-ceramic cultures of the region. If true, these vessels predate many known Andean traditions, raising the question of who carved them and why. One feature stood out during the excavations: a narrow channel carved into the stone beside each hollow. These channels are shallow but precise, and appear designed to drain or direct liquid. But what liquid? Snowmelt freezes quickly at this altitude. Rain is rare. Some researchers suggest ritual libations. Others propose that the channels were symbolic, mirroring patterns of water flow that once existed in the lowlands. In one vessel, the largest, a faint residue line runs along the inner curve, visible only under UV light. It forms a wave-like pattern, almost like the watermark on a wooden hull. But this line contains traces of calcium carbonate consistent not with snowfall, but with prolonged exposure to moving water in the sky. Could the vessels have been carved at a time when the climate differed drastically? Geological records show no ancient lakes at this altitude. Yet some fringe climatologists argue for short-lived glacial meltwater surges that could have created pools briefly, though not enough to justify boat-shaped hollows. Others turn to symbolic interpretations. Perhaps the vessels were used in sky rituals, acting as platforms for offerings lifted toward the heavens. In this reading, the direction toward the Southern Cross matters deeply. It was considered a cosmic gateway by many Andean cultures. The vessels, then, might have served as celestial containers, places where objects or bodies were prepared for spiritual journey. Still, this does not explain the striations, the marks of weight, pressure, and repeated contact. In 2019, a drone survey revealed something unexpected. A small depression on a nearby cliff, overlooked for decades, bore the faint outline of another hull, smaller and partially collapsed. The hollow was angled differently from the others, as though it had shifted over time. But beside it, etched into the stone with uncanny precision, was a line drawing. Simple, elegant. A curve with two pointed ends. A boat, floating not on water but beneath a stylized arc resembling the sky. If one traces the carvings gently, the image appears almost alive. A vessel held aloft by something unseen. A vessel not meant for rivers. When archaeologists returned to the main hollows with fresh eyes, they noticed one final detail. At the prow of the largest vessel, a tiny depression sits where a figurehead might have been too small to fit a carving, yet too deliberate to be accidental. A socket, perhaps. A point of attachment. As we've noted throughout this journey, mysteries speak in patterns. Dust, shaped like wings. Gates hung upon the wind. Pathways carved by breath. And here, vessels resting on mountains, boats without water, hulls without seas. Tonight, if one were to stand within one of these stone hollows, lying back against its cold curve, the vast Andean sky would unfold above like a deep blue ocean. Stars would scatter like floating embers, and one might feel just faintly the sensation of being held in something once meant to drift. A soft question rises then, like mist from the valley floor. If these vessels rested here after long journeys, what shores did they leave behind? Nearby, on a higher outcrop, recent surveyors found traces of another hollow, smaller, sharper, half eroded. And carved beside it, barely visible, a series of parallel lines. Lines that resemble the striations of wooden planks. Lines that echo the memory of something that travelled far and landed softly upon the sky. Hymns, etched in lightning. Night storms on the savannah are unlike storms anywhere else on Earth. They do not simply arrive, they gather, drawing themselves together from distant horizons, folding shadows into towering columns of cloud. Lightning comes first in silence, stitching the sky with silver before the thunder remembers to follow. And when it does, the sound rolls across the grasslands like something ancient waking up. It was in such a landscape, broad, flat, trembling with stormlight, that one of the strangest discoveries of the last century was made. In 1974, after a series of unusually intense electrical storms in central Namibia, a field team from a local wildlife reserve noticed something odd along a low granite ridge. A long band of rock, perhaps 30 meters in length, appeared scorched, not merely darkened but etched. Lines, curves, intersecting arcs had been burned into the surface, not superficially, but deep, as if the lightning had written rather than struck. Locals had long known of the ridge, calling it Ombu Yaav, the place where sky touches stone. For generations, shepherds avoided it during storms, claiming the ridge called lightning. Of course, many rock formations attract electrical strikes, but this ridge produced something different. Shapes that resembled deliberate carvings. The storm-etched lines were not random. Some curved in smooth spirals, Others branched into repeating fractal forms. A few formed diamond shapes so precise that geologists were initially convinced they were human-made petroglyphs. But upon closer inspection, the edges revealed patterns of melting and recrystallization consistent with plasma discharges, not steel or stone tools. And beneath the visible markings, microscopic channels extended several millimeters into the granite channels that matched the branching patterns of lightning filaments. Lightning had carved symbols, or something like them. Scholars still debate whether the markings constitute patterns worthy of interpretation, or merely the mesmerizing geometry of high-energy impacts. But the consistency of certain shapes unsettled even the skeptics. Across different storms, separated by years, the ridge displayed similar motifs, as though the sky repeated a script. One geologist remarked, "Lightning does not repeat itself, but here, it seems to practice." The site underwent formal study in 1977. Teams mapped the etched patterns and compared them to known Lichtenberg figures, branching motifs created when electrical discharges burn into surfaces. But while Lichtenberg patterns typically resemble tree branches or neural networks, these shapes were smoother, more regular. Some appeared to spiral inward, forming curls with near-perfect logarithmic symmetry. A physicist from Pretoria proposed that the ridge's unique mineral composition rich in quartz veins created a high resonance zone. He suggested that lightning discharges interacted with the crystal matrix, producing organized filament patterns, a neat scientific possibility. But it did not explain the repeated appearance of diamond shapes, arcs, and parallel line groups almost identical across separate events. As we noted earlier, many ancient anomalies arise from the interplay of natural forces and perception, pattern-seeking minds interpreting chance. But sometimes, chance forms patterns too precise to dismiss casually. In 1982, a researcher studying the ridge at dusk noticed something peculiar. When the setting sun hit the granite at a sharp angle, faint lines appeared beneath the newest markings. Lines older, weathered, but clearly related, etched long before human eyes ever studied the place. One pattern resembled a series of overlapping crescents. Another formed a swirling loop, like a stylized vortex. A third showed a tight cluster of parallel slashes repeating at regular intervals. How long had lightning been carving this ridge? Weathering analysis suggested that some etchings could be several thousand years old. Others, possibly tens of thousands, though such estimates remain uncertain. The Namibian interior has always hosted storms in some epochs, even more violent than today. What startled researchers further was the discovery of stones nearby, bearing smaller, portable versions of the etched patterns, pebbles, hand-sized fragments, each showing faint scorch traces and miniature lightning filaments. These had been collected by local tribes as charms, passed down for generations. When asked about their origin, elders said simply, "They are pieces of the sky's song." This phrase caught the attention of anthropologists. Among the San people, there is an old belief that lightning carries messages, not messages meant for humans, but messages from the earth to the sky and back. Some shamans speak of hearing sky hymns during deep trance states, describing rhythmic pulses and vibrations felt in the bones. Whether these beliefs intersect with the ridge's markings remains ambiguous, but the parallels are haunting. More peculiar still was an event documented in 1990. During a nighttime storm, a team camping a safe distance from the ridge observed a sequence of lightning strikes. 3 bolts hit the ridge in rapid succession, illuminating the granite in blinding bursts. When the team inspected the ridge at dawn, they saw fresh markings but also noticed that one of the older symbols had deepened, as though struck not directly, but charged again by proximity. Lightning, it seemed, could rewrite the stone. Some researchers began to suspect that the ridge acted as a kind of natural conductor, guiding electrical discharges into structured patterns. A lightning harp, one scientist called it. But that metaphor took on new meaning when audio recordings captured during storms were analyzed. The ridge vibrated not audibly, but within infrasonic frequencies. When its vibrations were accelerated into audible range, they produced tones low, rising, falling, almost melodic. One acoustician described the accelerated sound as a hymn, strange, slow, but undeniably structured. Hence the poetic name, hymns etched in lightning. A few fringe theorists proposed that the ridge encoded information perhaps geological, perhaps electromagnetic, etched over millennia in the only language lightning knows, a language of charge, arc, filament, and discharge. In this reading, the ridge becomes less a canvas and more a recorder. One theorist even suggested that lightning acts like a stylus, tracing patterns produced by Earth's shifting electrical fields, turning the ridge into a long-term archive of atmospheric history. Yet this idea remains unverified, beautiful but tenuous. Then, in 2016, something unexpected happened. A rare, high-energy blue jet discharge an upward-moving lightning bolt struck the ridge. Satellite instruments recorded the event from orbit. When researchers visited the site days later, they found a new formation unlike any previous marking. A perfectly symmetrical six-pointed figure, each arm branching into nested fractal curves. It was the most complex marking ever observed. And unsettlingly, one arm overlapped an older pattern, one nearly identical in shape, but eroded nearly smooth by time. Lightning had carved the same symbol twice, across what might have been centuries. As we've travelled through our ancient mysteries, we've encountered moments where nature seems to imitate intention. Winds carving polished corridors, rivers flowing uphill, fire frozen in amber. And now, here, lightning etches shapes with the patience of memory. One geologist, reflecting on the ridge at dusk, remarked quietly, "If the earth and sky have been talking to each other for millennia, perhaps this is simply where they write down their conversation. Perhaps. Or perhaps the patterns reflect something buried deeper beneath the granite, beneath the soil." Ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of quartz fissures beneath the ridge, arranged in a branching system, like a subterranean lightning tree. When modelled digitally, the fissures aligned with many of the etched shapes. The Earth's own internal scars, mirrored on its surface by storms, a natural echo, or a dialogue. Tonight, if one were to stand on the ridge during a storm, though no one should, they would feel the air grow thick, heavy with electric scent. The granite beneath would vibrate faintly, the wind would hold its breath, and when the lightning finally struck, the world would erupt in brilliant white, leaving behind new marks, fresh lines in the sky's long song. And in the hush that follows thunder's retreat, a question rises, soft, charged, lingering. If lightning remembers these shapes across ages, what message is it trying to write into the stone? Far from the ridge, deeper inland, another formation was recently discovered, smaller, but bearing the same etched crescents, the same parallel lines, patterns matching those on the Namibian ridge almost exactly, as though the sky has been writing in several places, as though the earth has been listening. The cradle of lost dawn. There are valleys where sunrise arrives, slowly hesitant, muted, as though the light itself must remember how to return. And then there are valleys where dawn seems to bloom all at once, unfurling in a quiet rush that feels older than the morning star itself. Deep within the rugged highlands of northern Laos lies one such place, a hidden basin embraced by steep limestone walls, where the first light of day gathers not in wandering streaks, but in patterns. Patterns too deliberate, too calm, to be explained by chance. The locals call it Hum Phaitip, the cradle of lost dawn. The name comes from an old Hmong tale, spoken softly at funerals and births alike. A story that says, the sun once slept in that basin before the world was fully formed. A poetic myth, nothing more. And yet, when French surveyors stumbled into the basin during a cartographic expedition in 1912, they recorded something extraordinary. At sunrise, bands of light rippled across the valley floor like pale golden water, tracing shapes that shifted subtly but predictably with the seasons. Those first observers thought it an atmospheric trick, perhaps the result of unusual mist or crystalline dust in the air. But when they returned in the dry season and witnessed the same phenomenon, light pooling, gathering, flowing, they realized the cause was not above them, but beneath. The valley floor was covered in stones. Not scattered, not random, arranged. Thousands of them, smooth, flat, pale, and laid out in long, curving rows. Some spiraled inward, some radiated outward, others formed arcs that overlapped with startling precision. At first glance, it looked like a dry riverbed made of stone. Yet no river had ever flowed here. Local memory held no flood. Geological surveys confirm no ancient channel. The stones had been placed by hands, many hands, over what must have been centuries. Yet no settlement exists anywhere near the basin. No tools, no pottery, no burial sites, no evidence of habitation. Just the stones, silent and patient, as though waiting for the sun. When light touches them, something peculiar happens. The paler stones brighten first, followed by darker ones in sequential waves. The effect resembles a slow-motion shimmer, but the stones are not reflective. They are made of limestone flecked with feldspar, dull in normal light. The shimmering seems to come not from brightness, but from arrangement. As the sun rises, its rays pass between the surrounding cliffs at precise angles, illuminating the rows in a choreography of shadow and glow. Scholars still debate whether this choreography was intentional, a monumental calendar of light, or an accidental byproduct of ancient stone clearing. But anyone who has stood in the valley at dawn speaks of a sense of overwhelming subtlety, as though each row of stones anticipates the next moment of light, as though the valley inhales before illumination arrives. The mainstream explanation describes the basin as a proto-astronomical field, possibly created by a pre-literate culture whose purpose was to track solstices and equinoxes. This is plausible. Many ancient communities marked seasons with stone arrangements, but no known tradition in this region used thousands of aligned stones, especially not without accompanying cultural artifacts. A more cautious interpretation suggests the stones were agricultural, perhaps ancient terraces or seed beds, but the rows are far too smooth, too consistent, and their spacing matches not agricultural needs but optical geometry. When researchers modeled the basin digitally, they found that the arrangement maps perfectly onto the sun's arc throughout the year, with certain rows illuminating fully only during rare solar alignments. One alignment, occurring only once every 18.6 years, the lunar standstill causes a full spiral of stones near the basin's center to ignite with pale light like a glowing shell. Locals still speak of this spiral softly, calling it the snail of the sky. As we've noted in earlier sections, ancient mysteries often intersect light, geometry, and the subtle breath of place. The gates that captured wind, the obsidian that captured a gaze, the lightning that carved its own script, and here, in this quiet basin, dawn captures a memory. Archaeologists return to the site in the 1,970 seconds, conducting closer examinations. Beneath the top layer of smooth stones lay a secondary layer, rougher, older. These foundational stones seem placed to elevate the smoother ones slightly, just enough to enhance the play of shadow when the sun rises at low angle. It is architecture by millimeters, precision disguised as simplicity. Even stranger, some of the stones contain small holes, narrow, conical depressions carved along their edges. The holes vary in depth, but align consistently with the angle of sunlight during equinox dawns. A few scholars believe these holes acted as shadow catchers or light funnels, amplifying the shimmering ripple effect across the basin floor. But others wonder how any pre-literate society in this isolated region would have developed an understanding of such elaborate optical design. Some geologists initially proposed that the holes were formed by erosion, yet their uniformity, identical diameters, identical slants contradicts natural explanation. In 1999, a team using laser scanning discovered something even more peculiar. The entire basin floor is subtly, almost imperceptibly convex. Not enough to be noticed by eye, just enough to allow light to flow across the surface like water, following curvature. Whoever arranged the stones understood not only the topography, but how light behaves on curved planes. And yet, still, no trace of the builders. Some fringe researchers speculate that the basin was once a ritual site, an open-air observatory where practitioners gathered before dawn to witness the slow awakening of the sun. Perhaps they believed dawn itself was alive, and by shaping the stones, they gave it a cradle. Others lean toward mythic interpretation, drawing from Hmong stories of the sleeping sun, a cosmic child who rested in a stone basin before rising to warm the earth each morning. These stories, though metaphoric, contain details eerily reminiscent of the valley's behavior, the emphasis on awakening, the idea that the sun must be guided or welcomed. A more grounded but still enigmatic idea suggests that the basin served as a light loom, a place where shadows were used as measurement tools for early astronomical cycles. In this reading, the valley becomes a vast, natural observatory, more subtle than Stonehenge, more ephemeral than the pyramids, relying not on towering structures but on the gentlest play of illumination. Yet even this interpretation fails to explain the basin's acoustics. When dawn breaks, the valley is silent, strangely so. Birds avoid it, insects grow quiet. The wind, which rises predictably each morning in the surrounding ridges, fails to enter the basin for several minutes after sunrise. Sound behaves oddly too. Voices carry farther, and whispers bounce along the stone rows as if guided by invisible channels. During one survey, an anthropologist spoke softly near the basin's center and was startled when her whisper returned from 10 meters away with surprising clarity. This acoustic stillness, paired with the light choreography, led some to suspect the basin was designed not only for viewing the dawn, but for hearing it. In 2011, researchers recorded audio during sunrise. The data revealed a faint, low-frequency hum, barely audible, occurring only in the minutes before full illumination. Some believed it to be seismic reverberation triggered by temperature change. Others suspected wind resonance. But the hum's consistency across seasons hinted at something more intentional. One researcher suggested the basin acts like a giant bowl, resonating subtly when the sun's first heat touches the stones. The hum is soft, like distant chanting, or like a memory vibrating in the bones of the earth. As we've seen again and again, ancient mysteries echo across sensory boundaries. Wind shapes pathways, lightning shapes stone, light shapes geometry, and here, dawn shapes sound. And always, beneath these phenomena, lies the quiet suggestion of intention. Yet the greatest enigma of the basin is not the light, not the sound, not the curvature. It is a single stone. Near the basin's center lies a flat slab, larger than all the others, engraved with faint lines almost erased by time. These lines form a pattern so subtle that early archaeologists overlooked it entirely. When traced carefully, they resemble a series of overlapping crescents, much like the shapes carved by lightning in Namibia, thousands of kilometers away. Coincidence, perhaps? Or the echo of some shared symbolic language carried through oral migration. But the crescents align with phases of the moon, phases that influence dawn position across seasons. The slab faces northeast toward the direction where dawn first touches the basin during late winter. Scholars still debate whether the crescents were carved by the basin's builders, or added later by a separate group who merely inherited the site. The weathering suggests age possibly older than the uppermost rows of stones. But without direct dating, the truth remains suspended. In 2020, ground-penetrating radar identified faint subsurface anomalies beneath the crescent slab, rectangular shapes arranged like chambers. But the rock is dense. Excavation risks collapse. The chambers remain sealed, unread. Perhaps they contain nothing. Perhaps they contain the memory of those who shaped dawn. Perhaps they are simply voids created by nature. And yet, something about the basin resists dismissal. Tonight, if one were to stand in the valley under a moonlit sky, they would see the stones glimmer faintly, as though anticipating the morning. The basin feels expectant, like a cradle waiting to be filled, and when dawn finally rises, light will gather in smooth ripples, unfolding across the valley in a choreography written long before any living memory. And then, as the hum stirs softly beneath the stones, a quiet question emerges, gentle as the first breath of day. If dawn was once shaped here, what other light has the world forgotten how to receive? Far to the south, in the mountains of northern Vietnam, a smaller basin has recently been found, its stone rows broken, its spiral incomplete. But at its center lies a slab with the same crescent pattern, 2 cradles, 2 dawns, and a story stretching across landscapes like the soft glow of morning, spheres that rolled alone. There are plains in the world where silence settles so thickly that even movement seems hesitant to disturb it. Broad grasslands or hard-packed deserts where the horizon stretches in a single, unbroken sweep, and time moves differently. In one such place, deep within the arid interior of Costa Rica's Diquís Delta, lie the spheres. Some sit alone, half emerged from soil, others rest in careful clusters, a few linger in remote forest clearings as if they drifted there in sleep, perfectly round, perfectly smooth. And though many cultures shaped stone, none are quite like these immense granite globes weighing tons, carved with a precision so uncanny they feel less made than born. But these are not the spheres we came for. For beyond the known Costa Rican spheres lies another scattering of rounded stones, far older, far stranger, and set in places where no known civilization ever thrived. They lie across 3 continents in a pattern so subtle that early archaeologists dismissed the similarity as coincidence. Only in recent decades has the pattern re-emerged quietly, like something rolling into view at the slow pace of deep time. The first of these anomalies was found in the 1,950 seconds in the Kazakh steppe, an expanse so vast that even today travellers can walk for hours without seeing a single tree. A geologist surveying the region stumbled upon a cluster of massive stone spheres arranged along a gentle incline. Some were half buried, others rested cleanly on the surface. Their diameters varied from the size of a melon to nearly 3 meters across, but their roundness was eerie, as though shaped with tools too patient for human hands. Locals called them kerek shala, the orphan stones. Stones, they said, that arrived alone. When researchers examined them closely, they found no chisel marks, no fractures, no seams. The spheres were hewn from a type of sandstone that did exist in the region, but not in the immediate vicinity. Transport would have required tremendous effort, and yet no known culture inhabited this remote expanse during the proposed time frame of their creation. No settlements, no pottery, nothing. Still, the stones remained silent, solitary, and arranged along what appeared to be a faint arc. For decades, the find was quietly catalogued and mostly forgotten. Other discoveries occupied archaeological focus. But then, in the 1,980 seconds, another cluster was found, this time in the far northern reaches of Botswana, near the edge of the Makadikgadi Pans. There, half submerged in the pale crust of a prehistoric lakebed, were rounded stones of a different composition, dense volcanic rock, polished by neither water nor wind. Their configuration mirrored the Kazakh arrangement, a subtle curve, like beads scattered along the edge of an invisible circle. The researcher who documented the Botswana stones noted something unsettling. The curve, when extended mathematically, aligned to a precise radius. Not random distribution, not geological accident, a radius, a structure, a ghost of order lingering in empty land. As we've seen throughout these mysteries, dawn cradles, lightning inscriptions, sky gates, the world sometimes preserves intention where no hands remain. And here too, in these scattered plains and ancient lakebeds, the stones whisper of motion. It was not until 2007 that the true puzzle emerged. A team analysing satellite imagery of the Australian outback discovered yet another set of spheres nearly identical in spacing and curvature to those in Kazakhstan and Botswana. These stones, located in a remote region of the Pilbara, were smaller but no less precise. Their alignment curved gently across a slope in a pattern that matched astonishingly the same arc traced by the other two sites. 3 continents, 3 arcs, 3 sets of stone spheres. Scholars still debate how natural processes might produce such similar forms across such different terrains. Spherical weathering can occur, yes, but not with such uniformity, and not in clusters arranged along radius-aligned arcs. Early attempts to date the spheres yielded contradictory results. Some samples from Kazakhstan suggested an age of several thousand years consistent with human activity. Others from Botswana yielded dates much older, tens of thousands of years, and the Australian samples, composed of exceptionally dense rock, resisted dating entirely. Because of this, one conservative theory emerged, that the spheres were natural, but later arranged by human hands. Perhaps nomads moved them, perhaps they served as markers, but this idea faltered quickly. Many spheres were found partially embedded in ancient soil layers, layers untouched for tens of thousands of years. Some were anchored too deeply to have been moved at all. Others rested in places where no prehistoric population is known to have ventured. Stranger still, faint linear depressions in the soil suggest that some spheres shifted after deposition, drifted, rolled. But rolled toward what? In 2013, a climatologist studying the Kazakh site made an unexpected observation. He noticed that the sphere's arc orientation aligned precisely with the dominant wind patterns of the region, not the modern winds, but the paleoclimatic winds of the late Pleistocene. Wind strong enough to move tons of stone? No. But perhaps wind strong enough to shift lighter material beneath them. Soft mud, glacial silt, causing slow, incremental movement over centuries. This theory gained traction briefly. Wind carving and guiding the spheres like marbles on a desert table. But it failed to explain the Botswana stones, which sit upon a hardened salt pan, or the Australian ones, perched upon iron-rich sedimentary crust. So the idea faded. And yet some patterns refused to fade. An interdisciplinary team noticed that the centers of the arcs, if extended, converged on celestial alignments. The Kazakh arc points to the rising position of Vega around 12,000 years ago. The Botswana arc aligns with the setting of Crux during the same epoch, and the Australian arc, when extended, points to the ancient rising azimuth of Canopus. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps not. As we noted in earlier sections, ancient builders often reached for the sky, cradling dawn, echoing lightning, opening gates to empty air. If these spheres belong to a forgotten tradition, perhaps their motion or their placement once traced the paths of stars. One archaeologist proposed that the spheres were once part of rolling astronomical markers. When pushed or allowed to drift downhill, their path might have marked angles of celestial rise or set. The arcs, then, would represent resting lines, positions where the stones naturally came to stop. A beautiful thought, yet there is no evidence of ramps, no causeways, no constructed surfaces for rolling, only bare earth and the long quiet of empty plains. Then, in 2016, something remarkable occurred. A storm in the Kazakh steppe washed away layers of silt surrounding several spheres. When researchers visited, they found new striations thin, shallow grooves etched into the soil beneath the stones. These grooves curved smoothly downhill in paths matching the broader arc. Some stones had moved, but moved recently, not by human hands, not by wind, not by erosion. One geologist, kneeling in the mud beside a sphere nearly 2 meters wide, murmured, "It's as if the ground itself shifted, and the sphere remembered how to roll." It was then that a new hypothesis emerged, softly at first, whispered in conferences, appearing in cautious footnotes. A hypothesis both delicate and daring. Perhaps the spheres did not roll by force, but by balance. Stone spheres of perfect roundness can move with astonishing ease when placed upon subtle gradients. Gradients so slight they feel flat to the human eye. The arcs, then, may represent ancient microslopes, geological tilts long since leveled or overgrown. The spheres, over millennia, may have drifted along these slopes, rolling tiny increments during rare storms or seismic tremors, coming to rest only when gravity allowed. Natural behavior, yes, but shaped by patterns too precise to feel accidental, as though the landscape once contained pathways, revealed only to perfectly round travelers. This idea gained quiet momentum. Researchers modeling long-term seismic vibrations suggested that over thousands of years, even a slight tremor repeated infinitesimally could shift a perfectly round object. A sphere might move centimeters, then stop, move again a decade later. Over centuries, these movements could form arcs, but why were the spheres so perfectly round in the first place? Nature can produce spherical stones, but rarely at this scale or precision. The Kazakh spheres are too smooth, the Botswana ones too dense, the Australian ones too evenly polished, unless, of course, they were shaped, not by tools in the traditional sense, but by conditions, pressure, fluidized sediment, thermal gradients we no longer fully understand. In 2020, microtomography of an Australian sphere revealed layered internal structure, alternating bands of crystal alignment as though shaped by rotational force during formation, as though the sphere was not carved, but spun. By what? By whom? No answers yet, but the image of stone being shaped by rotation, slow, patient, inevitable, lingers. Some fringe theorists imagine a now-lost culture that used these spheres as markers or instruments, objects that tracked celestial cycles through motion. But without settlements, without artifacts, this interpretation remains beautiful speculation. Others propose something more natural yet no less elegant, that the spheres formed in geologically active regions and later migrated across continents through slow tectonic processes, leaving their arcs like signatures of the Earth's own shifting breath. But still, why so round? And why do the arcs across continents mirror one another? And why do some spheres appear to have moved within living memory? One quiet detail deepens the mystery. In Kazakhstan, one sphere bears faint incisions, 3 short, parallel lines weathered nearly smooth. And in Botswana, a similar marking appears on a smaller sphere, same length ratio, same spacing. In Australia too, a faint pattern appears beneath iron-rich patina. 3 lines, not tool marks, not weathering, but perhaps a symbol repeated across continents on stones that seem to have travelled only by their own mysterious geometry. Tonight, if one were to sit beside one of these lonely travellers feeling its cool curve beneath the palm, they might sense a strange stillness, not of immobility, but of resting. as though the sphere waits for something subtle, a tremor, a tilt, a shift in balance to remind it how to move again. And in that stillness, a question rolls softly into the mind, as gentle as a sphere's slow journey through ages. If these spheres rolled alone, what first set them on their long, patient paths? Far away, new satellite imaging shows another arc forming, this time in Patagonia. A cluster of rounded stones rests upon a slope so slight it is nearly invisible. 3 continents, soon, perhaps 4. And the arcs, when mapped together, form a shape uncanny in its familiarity. The curve of an orbit, or the long, slow path of something returning. Tombs tending their gardens. There are burial places so still, so solemn, that even the wind lowers its voice when it passes over them. And then there are places where the quiet feels tended, as though something unseen moves gently among the stones, arranging, cultivating, preserving. In the remote foothills of northern Mongolia, where rolling grasslands rise toward jagged peaks and larch forests breathe mist into the dawn, lies one such place, a necropolis unlike any other. A place where the dead appear not abandoned, but accompanied. It began with flowers. Not wildflowers, though the region has plenty edelweiss, saxifrage, tiny alpine blooms that cling proudly to the coldest earth. No, these were different, bright, delicate, growing in patterns too deliberate for chance. Long before archaeologists ever stepped foot there, herders spoke of a hillside where strange flowers bloomed only above old graves, even in seasons when nothing should grow at all. They said the earth was awake there, that the dead looked after their own beds. Such tales sound poetic, the kind that accrue naturally around lonely hillsides and ancient burials. Yet when the first scientific expedition arrived in the summer of 1998, the team found something astonishing. The hillside was dotted with stone-lined graves, rectangular, carefully oriented, each containing a single occupant. Most belonged to the Bronze Age Chemachek culture, roughly 2,500, 1,800 BCE, known for their enigmatic anthropomorphic stelae. But here, the graves were surrounded by rings of vegetation, concentric circles of flowers and herbs that grew in symmetrical patterns, lush and inexplicable. Not random patches, not natural clusters. Gardens arranged around tombs that had been undisturbed for nearly 4,000 years. More curious still, the species of plants flourishing here did not match the surrounding flora. Some grew nowhere else in the valley. A few grew nowhere else in the entire region. Botanists identified several as relatives of medicinal herbs used in early Mongolic cultures, but their exact variants were unknown to science. And yet, there they were, thriving in carefully shaped rings around individual graves, each grave surrounded by its own distinct botanical signature. Scholars still debate whether these plants represent ancient cultivation seeds placed with the dead, perhaps, or whether the graves themselves create microenvironments that favor unusual growth. But the patterns are too precise, too intentional. Someone tended these graves long ago, or something still does. As we've seen throughout this journey, handprints in ancient stone, mirrors angled toward abyss, gates suspended above air, some mysteries act as quiet custodians of memory. This necropolis feels like one of them, a place where the boundary between tending and remembering blurs. The floral rings follow a consistent design, an outer circle of hardy shrubs, an inner ring of low flowers, and at the very center, often directly above the burial chamber, a cluster of darker, leafy plants that seem to drink more deeply from the soil. These central clusters remain green even in early frost, long after nearby vegetation withers. When soil samples were taken, researchers discovered unusually high concentrations of certain minerals, phosphates, rare trace elements, even pockets of warmth retained longer than the surrounding ground. Some argued that decomposing bodies enriched the soil, but bodies decompose quickly, and these graves were millennia old. Chemical enrichment should have faded ages ago, unless something reintroduced nutrients over time, unless something tended the soil. A fringe theory suggested that the plants themselves altered the soil chemistry, creating a self-sustaining cycle. But this does not explain the patterns, the spacing, the symmetry, the distinct plant species designated for each grave as though by design. What's more, the floral rings shift. Satellite images comparing photos from the early 2000s to images taken 20 years later reveal subtle migrations. Some rings have expanded, others contracted, A few shifted slightly downslope, maintaining perfect circularity despite erosion. Plants do not rearrange themselves, not like this, and yet, the gardens around these tombs appear to correct their shapes over time, as though preserving an ancient blueprint. One botanist remarked, "It is not the plants that move, it is the pattern that persists." The necropolis contains over 80 graves. All share the same floral architecture, though each ring has unique species compositions. Some believe these compositions reflect the identities or roles of the individuals buried there: healers, shamans, artisans, or respected elders. But without inscriptions, the truth remains hidden. As we noted earlier, the Chemachek culture is known for its enigmatic stele carved with abstract human shapes. One such stele stands near the center of this necropolis, a tall, narrow stone with faint arms etched along its sides and an oval face worn smooth by centuries of weather. Beneath this stele, the largest garden grows a triple-ringed floral pattern, unlike the simpler designs around other tombs. Its plants bloom in staggered waves, early blossoms followed by late ones, ensuring color from spring through autumn. Locals call this grave the Keeper. They say the flowers bloom longest here because the one who watches still breathes. A poetic myth, yet the grave's floral pattern is indeed more elaborate than all others. Further anomalies emerged when archaeologists examined temperature readings. The soil above the tombs retains warmth long after sunset, several degrees warmer than neighboring Earth, though no geothermal activity exists beneath. Some attribute this to the dense root systems of the garden plants. Others suspect more unusual processes. The warmth is faint, subtle, but unmistakable, a gentle heat, like breath beneath the soil. Then there are the noises. During deep night data collection in 2012, researchers reported hearing faint sounds, soft rustles, almost like whispered movement emanating from the floral rings. At first they assumed it was wind or wildlife. But the valley was still, the air unmoving, no insects, no birds, and the sounds came not from outside the rings, but from within. Microphones placed near several graves recorded intermittent patterns, tiny shifts, root creaks, soil settling noises far too rhythmic to be purely natural. Some argued the sounds resulted from temperature contraction in the cooling earth. Perhaps. But why only within the rings? Why not throughout the valley? And why do the patterns repeat season after season? In one particularly odd recording, the microphone caught a soft, rhythmic pulsing beneath the largest grave. Not loud, not mechanical, more like the slow, patient pulse of water droplets falling into deep earth, or the breathing of roots. One researcher, listening late at night, described the sound as the garden tending itself. She meant it metaphorically, and yet the idea lingers. Another enigma concerns the seeds found within the graves. In 2015, archaeobotanists collected samples from burial pits. Some seeds were familiar: barley, medicinal herbs, wildflowers, but others belonged to no known species. Their genetic sequences matched nothing in living flora. A few partially germinated in controlled environments, producing tiny shoots that grew rapidly at first, then stopped suddenly, as though waiting for a type of soil or climate missing from the modern world. One shoot, grown from a seed found in a child's grave, produced a faint luminescence along the underside of its leaves, an ethereal glow visible only in total darkness. The plant lived only 10 days. When it died, its roots darkened the soil in a spiral pattern, a spiral nearly identical to the stone patterns found in Laos's Cradle of Dawn. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or echoes of an older symbolic language once carried silently across continents. As we've seen, again and again, patterns recur. Light spirals, stone spirals, floral spirals, echoing each other like distant harmonies, binding places that never knew each other in ways we are only beginning to notice. A more grounded interpretation suggests that ancient shamans planted specific herbs atop burials to aid the spirit's transition. The gardens, then, may represent lingering ancient horticulture, a tradition forgotten yet still blooming. But this does not explain the symmetry, nor the movement, nor the way each garden seems precisely tuned to its tomb. In 2021, LiDAR scans revealed faint trenches connecting some of the grave's subsurface channels shaped like branching roots. The trenches are too regular to be natural. They connect groups of tombs like a network, a necropolis of gardens, a garden of connections. One anthropologist proposed that the entire hillside functioned as a living memorial soil, arranged to carry nutrients from grave to grave, linking the dead in cycles of botanical exchange. In this interpretation, the plants are not merely decorations, they are continuations, extensions of memory, feeding into the earth and rising again in colour. But a softer hypothesis lingers too, one spoken quietly among the researchers who have spent long nights camped beside the gardens. They say the necropolis feels aware, not alive in a literal sense, but gently present, like an old friend who remembers your footsteps. Some speak of waking to find new blossoms around a grave that had none the day before. Others claim the floral rings appear greener after snowfall, as though the plants absorb the cold and return warmth. And one botanist, after a week-long study, confided in a colleague that she often felt watched, but not with malice. More like the attentive gaze of a caretaker ensuring she did not disturb anything fragile. Tonight, if one were to walk among these ancient gardens under a soft Mongolian moon, they would find the air unusually gentle. The flowers, some pale, some violet, some a luminous shade between green and gold, might sway even without breeze. The soil beneath the feet would feel warm in certain patches, and the silence would be deep but not empty, like a library of scents and shadows. At the centre of the hillside, near the keeper's grave, the flowers form a spiral ring that glows faintly in moonlight, a trick of reflected frost perhaps, or something else, something that recalls the flame shapes caught in amber, the lightning spirals carved into stone, the dawn crests etched into ancient slabs, a language spoken gently across ages, a language of pattern, tending, remembering. And in this quiet cradle of soil and petal, one final question rises soft as wind, brushing a long-forgotten name. If the dead here tended their own gardens, what were they preparing the earth to remember long after their bones were gone? Below the hillside, on a lower slope seldom visited, recent surveys found a cluster of new floral rings, faint, young, delicate. No graves lie beneath them, yet the patterns match, as though something unseen is planting ahead. Conclusion. Night settles softly over the scattered sites of our long journey, the valleys and cliffs, the wind-worn plateaus, the stone-lined graves, and the quiet bowls of dawn. In every direction, the ancient world exhales its slow, patient breath. Dust that once dreamed of lift still lies on forgotten plateaus. Mirrors still face their waiting darkness. Thrones sit in circles beneath unbroken stars. Across deserts, mountains, and forests, echoes of intention linger, carved in wind, in fire, in stone, in the very soil that remembers the warmth of vanished hands. And as the darkness deepens, the mysteries no longer feel like riddles waiting to be solved, but quiet conversations still unfolding. Perhaps the world did not lose these meanings. Perhaps it only set them down gently for another age, to find patterns held in amber, in obsidian, in lightning-scarred rock, waiting for the soft curiosity of wandering minds. Somewhere, a gate still hums in the wind, a codex still whispers to the turning page, a cradle of stone still brightens with the first touch of dawn. And here, on the edge of sleep, these mysteries become less about answers and more about presence. The steady, timeless pulse of the earth, carrying its oldest stories with a patience far greater than ours. We simply step close enough, for a moment, to listen. In the hush of this final breath, as if the ancient world leans in one last time, a soft question lingers in the dark. What else lies quietly out there, waiting for light, wind, or wonder to reveal it again? A silence follows deep, gentle, unbroken, and the night closes its pages.